All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Boys Table Podcast, episode 24. We got some layoffs for you.
24 is reverse of 42.
Mm-hmm. That means that it's, I don't know, half of a simulation.
Only half. The clock is still very real.
So, you get laid off lately?
In a way.
Basically, I think the most pressing topic to discuss, since we have last done a podcast about Randy Pitchford's fucking magic trick, was probably that Blizzard layoff stuff. But I guess sort of the writing's been on the wall since they canceled Heroes of the Storm, right? They've kind of been restructuring quite a bit. I mean, even since before then, when they were talking about doing a lot of mobile games at BlizzCon.
Yeah. While getting Chinese people to rebrand their existing mobile games for them, as it turns out. Which is just amazing that they thought that was going to fly with anybody. Oh, man.
I mean, we've all talked about how casuals care about brand name recognition and like how Blizzard's logo carries a lot of their shitty behavior. And yet they didn't even get it. Like, technically, the Blizzard logo is on Diablo Immortal, but it's very clearly not developed by them. Like, it even has like the other, I think it's NetEase or something, the Chinese developer.
Yeah. It is literally one of their failed games that just got quickly rebranded with Diablo. And the thing is it looks better than Diablo 3 still. Like, it is objectively a better game than Diablo 3 in basically every respect that has been demonstrated. And It's a failed Chinese game.
Guess the standards are higher over there.
Yep. Because there's so many fucking Chinese mobile games. Like, right now, Azurland's probably one of the biggest ones coming out of China that I'm personally aware of. It's gaining huge traction. And to compete with that, you have to sort of know your shit. And NetEase is kind of just... It's a name I've definitely heard before. I can't remember in which context, but it's not a good one. Not at all. But it's basically like Blizzard China. You can think of it.
And like in terms of quality or just in outreach?
I think in terms of like the relationship with Blizzard, like I think
they
have had someone mentioned it to me before. I don't know actual specifics, but I think that they actually like did potentially localization or something for Blizzard in the past. I'm not entirely sure. I just remember someone mentioning it that like that's not like some random partnership.
Well, I guess that would make sense because I've never heard of this developer before the Diablo Immortal fiasco, so.
No. Well, NetEase is pretty significant, I think. Not as big as like Tencent. Are they? Maybe they're owned by Tencent. Let me have a quick gander here. But I know I've heard it.
Well, that would be the ultimate nail in the fucking simulation coffin if now Tencent was trying to own Blizzard.
I mean, Tencent basically already owns like a lot of China. Tencent, as I believe I mentioned in a previous podcast, like look towards the future and like say like 10 years. Tencent is going to be a lot more well known of a name than Blizzard for sure. I mean, already at this point, unless you are an existing Blizzard fanboy, Tencent is a bigger name. And NetEase, also, yes, NetEase has done the localizations. I was correct. They did the local versions of Warcraft 3, World of Warcraft, Jock MTG, StarCraft 2, Diablo 3, expansion, and Overweight. So NetEase has indeed been a long-standing partner of Blizzard.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see Tencent mentioned on here. But Tencent is enormous. They basically operate China's equivalent of like Facebook and stuff, and they own an extremely large number of companies that have to deal with gaming and chat services and stuff like that. And Tencent, I believe, also has a significant hand in Discord as well. And you could basically think of them as the equivalent of Google if Google was more into like actually like integrating with digital technology and not just trying to troll people through copyright. And yeah, they're I don't know if they really have anything to do with hardware, but they're pretty enormous, and they definitely intend to expand into the West as they've been making acquisitions all over the place. So NetEase is sort of independent of all that, but you probably like don't really, unless you look at the localizations, you won't really see a lot of NetEase association. But it was pretty clear that NetEase having some failed mobile game, I forget the exact name of it. Someone posted some comparisons in the past when this whole fiasco started.
Yeah.
That Blizzard is obviously, it's, to everybody, it's a failing company. They're dying, and they haven't produced any good content for a really long time. And the really interesting thing about Blizzard is that Blizzard, as we know it now, actually is not really Blizzard. There was some analysis that was directed my way about the acquisition of Blizzard and the ass invasion thing. Is that Blizzard is actually more like Vivendi Gaming. So there is a term for it that I don't remember, but basically a lot of Blizzard staff got called, and then Vivendi kind of bundled them all up, and then they more or less integrated with Activision. And Metzen was one of the few not to get called, and he was just kind of like their mascot. He was like the token mascot of that. We have a name that people recognize, so it's still Blizzard, when very evidently it wasn't. Of course, they had been dealing with Ass Invasion for a very long time prior to the quote unquote merger, but I believe Vivendi actually still holds majority shares in Blizzard, which is not how selling something normally works. So it's definitely really, really complicated, but the nut of it is if you're an employee at Blizzard's, you will actually, if you're going to get laid off, you're actually going to get laid off in one of the scummiest, most tasteless, most insanely fucking hysterical manners I have ever heard of. Where they allegedly handed out loot boxes with an 8.3, of course, 3% chance of containing the paper that determined you were being booted from the company. Like, I can't think of a more tasteless way to dismiss people from a corporation. That's so fucking like insane. It's precisely what I would expect for them. It's like the final act of ultimate disrespect to their own people. It's incredible.
I thought that was a satire piece.
Was it? I mean, I really wouldn't be surprised, but I don't bother reading up too much on this. But I mean, I would believe it that it was, and I believe it that it wasn't. In either event, Blizzard laid off what was it, 800 people, and then they immediately opened job listing for 140 people, including like
Yeah.
extremely significant roles, like lead concept artists and stuff like. So Blizzard is definitely like free falling at this point. It's going to take them a long point for it actually really to make a difference. But some of the impacts of their very, 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 very awful decision making over the last 15 years is finally starting to bop them. And it's very entertaining. It has been a very, very good year for the consumer because more people are starting to realize just how fucked up YouTube is, just by extent of how absolutely insane it's gotten for the average user on YouTube. And to see Blizzard finally like show some kind of mortality. To, in the same sense that when THQ finally died, THQ's history to finally dying is absolutely insane. Because
Yeah.
they were never known as a good developer or a good publisher. I believe that THQ was originally known as LJN, which has extreme historical significance of being terrible. And they just kept enduring until, you know, very modern time where they finally died, and a lot of it didn't even die. The fucking Darksiders still saw another shitty piece thrown out in its franchise. Like, there's still people with the little shit curdles in their hands running around. THQ still loves on. It's really bad that it took it that long to just sort of disseminate, and it's still not actually dead. Whereas Blizzard at one point did actually produce reasonable games a very long time ago. So it is pretty significant to see them start kind of bleeding like that, but I still think it's a long way until we start seeing real positive gains from it. What's more than likely is they're going to get really desperate. I mean, Overweight in itself and StarCraft 2 are very desperate, as it was. Diablo 3 was kind of like a pet project gone horribly wrong. Like, Tony accidentally published his weekend drink off game with his buddies, and they had to quickly scramble and call it a game and say, yeah, we actually intended to release this. Just don't mind the fact that it's obviously never been tested or anything, but the rest of it's like clear like desperation. StarCraft 2 was absolute desperation. World of Warcraft has been a disaster for a while now. Even like the hardcore fans of World of Warcraft who stuck it through thin and thick for so many years are getting really, really, really sick with the direction that game has gone. And then Overweight is just a disaster. And then Jock MTG is Jock MTG, whose only real value seems to be exploiting the game and getting Blizzard to very, very quickly hotfix it. I've heard some legends that at some point it's possible basically to just spawn infinite units in that game.
In what, Hearthstone?
Yeah. There was some interaction of some cards that just allow you just to keep making shit or something.
Oh yeah, you could just chain a bunch of. I thought you meant like people were somehow using I don't know, man. After that Fallout nonsense from Bethesda, I thought people were using console commands or something. I just had the completely different impression.
Yeah, that's amazing in itself. That Bethesda. I mean, this is Bethesda. So Bethesda, when the first thing you hear is Bethesda, the first thing you think of is Home Alone. Bethesda made Home Alone, that great game. And then they released a bunch of buggy, untested bullshit prototypes afterwards that for some reason was enough to keep them on life support. So you don't get surprised when you hear that Bethesda releases a game and it's a buggy piece of shit, and it's obviously just a slightly reskinned version of a previous quote unquote game they released a year or two ago. Or it literally is in the case of Skyrim that they've re-released so many times. But then you get to Fallout 69, and even for Bethesda, that's just like absolute absurdity what has happened with that title. When Bethesda themselves says that something will be unpolished, you know, to insinuate that they're trying to pass off shit like Skyrim is polished.
Yep.
You know you're in for a wacky ride, and what a wacky ride it has been. Where if people discover GM Island, they just flat out ban their account instead of fixing the exploit that allowed them to get.
That really just, holy shit, man.
This is incredible. It's not just like it's buggy, it's like the management of it is basically as bad as you could get. It's like
You cut out.
there's all these companies just doing such insane fucking shit side by side by side. It's just incredible how brazen they've gotten with this.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the other things that I was thinking about back in when StarCraft 2 came out, I realized that if any other developer if any other developer had made the game, let alone done the management side of it, then that game would not have picked up. That game would not
gone nowhere.
Yeah.
It would have just been like Command & Conquer 3. It would have just flopped on release, and that's it.
It would have been a giant disaster. It would have been a great disappointment. It would have been whatever.
Mean, even if it was still Blizzard, if it wasn't StarCraft, it still would have flopped just as hard. StarCraft 2 still flopped. It made money by extent of having 3 installations and a bunch of apologists behind it. You'll never find a single person who will claim that StarCraft 2 is actually a good game. There's like the 1 in a million people who will claim that the story in the single-player campaign is passable by stretching their identity of standards to a length that the Goatsy man himself would blush, but there's never a single person in the competitive scene or otherwise who's ever thought StarCraft 2 was actually a worthy sequel to StarCraft 1. It was more like, well, it's StarCraft, and I'm invested in the whole love story, so I guess I gotta saddle up and carry on. And that's kind of like the only apologism I've seen. Anybody else who tried to like apologize for the custom content, there was quite a few of them before the game actually came out into beta. They all disappeared as soon as the editor came out. It was like as if 1,000 autistic voices were all silenced at once.
Yes,
which
the
was an
Death
amazing
Star
thing to
of
see.
the marketplace, the map
Because
marketplace.
yeah,
But
it was something I'd foretold for a very long time, and a lot of people didn't believe me, and then it happened, and then
see, but the thing is, like,
they all just
because the logo was still there, people were still buying into it way more than it should
yep.
have been. And I feel like people are finally waking up, sort of like what you said about World of Warcraft, where people are now realizing that, holy shit, wait, this company's a joke, and they've actually been a joke for a while. And on top of all that, they've all of these products that I bought. If this didn't have the company's name on it, I wouldn't have bought them, and I wouldn't have spent time on them, and I would have not defended my own purchasing decisions for them. I wouldn't have apologized for them. I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have done that. Like if you just
Yeah.
look at StarCraft 2 and you just say, all right, what if that was released by fucking Westwood from under EA or something? Like it would be a laughing stock. And then you look at fucking, people are looking at World of Warcraft now. People are looking at fucking Diablo Immortal, and they're seeing that it actually isn't Blizzard developing it, and they're making that connection already. They're already saying like, oh wait, Blizzard isn't developing that, and so I have no interest in it, even though it's got the Diablo name on it. And then Blizzard reacts very stupidly and starts yelling at people and telling them they have phones.
Well, they've been doing that for a while too. That's what opened a lot of people. But most people, when they already have a positive projection about something, they're more likely to think positive about it, no matter really what happens. People will try to focus into that positivity and just ignore negative things because it'll put a lot of their existing conjecture into question. But when you look at things objectively or neutrally, there's never anything positive about anything Blizzard has done, and pretty much ever since Warcraft 3 is alpha. And those people just never associate, like, every single community I've ever seen outside of Mapster, I've never seen a single fucking person who's actually had a positive thing to say about Blizzard. Even if they're playing Blizzard's games like Overwatch or World of Warcraft, they usually have something to bitch about whenever the subject comes up. Especially a lot of people who will put up with the games but absolutely despise the company. That is the overwhelming sense I have seen in very large communities. And that's really not healthy for Blizzard's image, but you still see a lot of these people still actually playing their games. So they've still got some attachment to that nostalgia or whatever, where they're trying to live in the fantasy, or it's because there's no real competition. And the competition thing is actually something I can talk about in regards to that later on. But you said you wanted to talk about platforms because competition has to do with that as well. As Blizzard, when you think about it, okay, so Blizzard's really fucked up in basically everything they've possibly done. So the natural thing you would do as a consumer is, well, if one company does something really fucking bad, I'll just go to another company. I'll just get another product. But what exactly is competing with Blizzard in terms of products right now? In terms of Jock MTG, I think Shadowverse may be a competitor, but unfortunately, I don't know anything about that game whatsoever. In terms of World of Warcraft, I actually can't think of another MMO that's even really comparable. I mean, Final Fantasy XIV is a carbon copy of it, but Final Fantasy XIV is also a very not solo friendly game. And you'll actually find very bizarrely that a lot of people who still play World of Warcraft are actually predominantly solo players, with the exception of people who are with their guild and actually still raiding. Like there's no real middle ground between them that I have seen, which is really surprising to me because it wasn't like that when I played really consistently. But throughout my rant series I was recording last year, I came across that discovery. It was really strange. So if those players wanted to switch to another MMO with that mindset, there really isn't an option for them, unless they want to go back to like Guild Wars 1 or something. But Guild Wars 1 has not aged well at all. But with StarCraft 2, there really isn't a competitor. You basically have to go back to older games. And you'll find a lot of people don't want to do that because they're like the juvenile mindset that like 3D is better and all this other stuff. They're not even usually willing to try older games. A lot of them aren't even willing to try StarCraft 1. And then look at Diablo 3. Now you could make some argument that, say, for example, Path of Exile is a competitor for Diablo 3, but having played Path of Exile, I wasn't too impressed by it. Certainly not more than Diablo 3. And I mean, visually it's better, but that's not exactly difficult. So, if you look back, you would say, like, well, Titan Quest was like the alternative to Diablo 2, but Titan Quest is a heaping pile of shit as well. And yeah, you kind of just go back to like Diablo 2. Well, the multiplayer for Diablo 2 is a disaster because if you join and leave a game too fast or whatever, you just actually get silently banned from the server for 15, 20, 30 minutes. And it's been like that for a while where you join a game too quickly after you log in or whatever. It actually just thinks you're a bot and just silently bans you. So that's been going on for years. That was their answer to bots. Bots, which are programs, which people are like, oh, you're gonna ban me if I join and leave a game too fast. I'll just add a fucking wait timer. Bots just circumvent the whole thing. It just fucks over legitimate players. So a lot of shit like that if you want to play a multiplayer or whatever like that. And in fact, Diablo 2 really doesn't have a lot of replay value after what they've done to it with Lord of Destruction and all this other shit. So there's not really like a lot of alternatives to Diablo 3 either. Now, Overweight is one that does have a lot of competition because the shooter market is incredibly oversaturated. So that's when I just don't understand why anybody would ever put themselves to that game except for brand loyalty. There's nothing
And
unique
porn.
whatsoever about it. Yeah, and porn. That's actually a really good point since I did bring that up before. Uh, that does actually, I believe, drive a lot of the what's the word for it? A lot of the
Brand engagement.
yeah, well, not necessarily engagement, but a lot of like the circulation of information. Like it keeps Overweight at the forefront. And Blizzard knew that, and that's why they made a big fuss about porn when the game was first released because it directed people's attention to it. And the thing about that is, even though it's third-party content, it keeps the names and logos at the forefront in people's thoughts. It's basically free advertising and free marketing. It's precisely what they wanted. So that I think actually worked really well in their favor. And it's, I would say, like at least the second most major thing keeping the game active. And so it's definitely a very, very, good marketing move on their behalf. It's unfortunate to see Heroes of the Storm get the lowdown because I think that was actually the strongest title that they had potential in since Warcraft 3's alpha. Since at least when it was released, and some of the changes they made behind it were actually pretty positive. The utility creep and everything like that was pretty negative for the game. All the Overwatch heroes that got added were complete cancer, and a lot of the reworks and stuff like that really fucked it over. But overall, it was still actually at times a legitimately fun game and had a lot of potential to it. But what they needed was some actual people on it who had designed a game before, not people like fucking Dustin Breder who had never touched a game before. Unfortunately, it was competing with League of Legends and Dota 2, but while they could have played off of its strengths, they didn't. Instead, they copy pasted League's really, really, really bad loot box system and then locked everything into it, which drove away a lot of the sales they were getting and made the game much more frustrating for the average player. And yeah, their unlockable heroes is actually can take quite a long time to unlock heroes in that game when you're at a high level like I was. It was basically you're looking at potentially like weeks of grinding dailies to get enough gold, which can be very frustrating as well. And it has single player support, which is a lot better than League of Legends. I'll give them that. Their AI is better, even though it has a lot of really fucked up shit in it. But they could have done so much more with it, and of course, they didn't. Plus, it's StarCraft 2's engine, so it performs like absolute garbage. But in terms of competitors, I think actually Heroes of the Storm was probably the most viable out of their current roster to actually, be fairly sustainable for how cheap it was, considering they didn't have to make a new engine for it. They really weren't making new assets for it. And they weren't even hiring artists for it. If you take a look at that fucking Kaldazad splash screen I showed you guys a while ago,
Yeah.
where they obviously just copy pasted the feet, didn't even pay attention to where the fuck they were facing. But no, Blizzard is definitely looking poised to enter the mobile market that is already massively oversaturated with companies far more skilled and far more competent than they ever could have been. I don't think that's going to go terribly well for them.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is you were talking about competition. You're talking about different platforms. I definitely think that there's no competition really to StarCraft 2 because there's no RTS games being made these days. There's just a bunch of like weird mobile lights or whatever. And I think that also looking at I guess Path of Exile probably is the like the de facto successor to Diablo. in that that's what the casuals, the audience of Diablo themselves, have actually decided to play. I say casual kind of loosely there because there are a lot of people who play it in a quote unquote hardcore fashion, but obviously, like that is the game of choice basically for that sort of consumer base.
Grim Dawn was looking to be a pretty strong competitor, but for some reason it didn't really pan out. I am gonna LP that game sometime and see how it turned out, but it just kind of fell off the face of the earth midway through development and then released and just was forgotten about. So something disastrous was.
Should play
Early on,
Hellgate
it was
London.
looking. It was like, oh, Hellgate.
It's pretty exciting.
From what I've heard, Hellgate London actually has a lot of code straight out of Diablo 2.
Wouldn't surprise me.
And
I
when
thought
I
wasn't it a 3D game too, or no?
yeah, I have played that game, the Chinese version of it, the second version, and apparently the first version was actually a lot worse than the version I played, which is hard to believe. But there was a lot of stuff like the game just deleting items out of your inventory and shit like that. Like it was an absolute fucking mess. And then the version I played, which I have some XXE footage out of, was so fucking busted. I couldn't even put into words. It was as if you were playing like a Chinese mobile phone from the 90s.
Yeah, and that was
Shit
supposed to
was just
be the Diablo
yep.
competitor, the Diablo killer.
That was supposed to be basically what Borderlands ended up, except not shit. Except it was just as shit as Borderlands. And it went fucking nowhere. And then the Chinese gobbled it up. Just like they gobbled up Mythos. And Mythos was actually that was one of the pet projects, I believe, for the same developer of Hellgate London. It's been a while, I can't quite remember. Mythos was basically Diablo 3. Like when I played Diablo 3, I thought, hey, this looks exactly like fucking Mythos. Because Blizzard literally copy pasted Mythos for Diablo 3 visually. Because that's basically what Mythos looked like. Because Mythos was literally some developer pet project. I believe under the guise of testing netcode. Except unlike Hellgate London, it actually did have functional netcode, and it was actually sort of a Diablo game, and it was a hell of a lot more fun to play, despite the way it looked, than Diablo 3 was. So, of course, Blizzard copy pasted a lot of the things from Mythos, including the loot system. The loot system in Diablo 3, the player specific loot system, that's all from Mythos. Blizzard copy pasted literally everything from Mythos in that regard, and then would go and attack the Mythos developers over Facebook because that's precisely the way Blizzard works.
Fuck those guys.
Fuck those losers. And after stealing basically everything they'd done, I guess after they stole from them, who then stole from an academic website, I don't know,
Game
they
dev
kind of
done
lose
that,
track
dude.
of all of it. There was definitely a lot of theft going on in any event, but yeah, Mythos, if it had actually shaped up and then not got pawned off to China, it could have been a pretty good staging point for Diablo. You have Torchlight, which was an utter train wreck through and through. I couldn't even force myself to play any more than half an hour of that drivel.
It's a
And
very
somehow that's
casualification of the system, I feel like,
it was
compared to
bad.
Diablo
It
2.
was horrible. It actually looked worse than Mythos, despite the fact it was less cartoony. It managed to actually look worse. It was pretty fantastic. And then somehow that saw a sequel, which also just didn't exist for some reason. It just never hit anything. And there have been the biggest one that really hits the most hard is Lineage 3. Because around the time Diablo 3 was, I believe, around beta or something like that, Lineage 3 had a gameplay video that was released, and it was basically everything Diablo 3 should have been. It looked good. The performance wasn't really that great, but you were talking about up to like 1,000 units on the screen. It had like functional, like cursor related spell systems and stuff like that. But for some reason, Lineage 3 never actually manifested. And I don't know if really any information has been released about it since. I haven't really heard about it. There was Lineage Eternal for a mobile, which is just, I think, just Lineage 2 or something like that. I don't know. It's a really weird fuck up, whatever it is. But Lineage 3 just does it had the potential to really, like, as just a video as it was basically like Blizzard couldn't make a game that looked this good and played like this in 30 years. No fucking way. Because it had actual like developers behind it. But NC Soft doesn't exactly have a very great track record either. And then it just didn't happen. So Diablo 3 effectively had no real competition other than Path of Exile. And as Brevet said, Blizzard did a pretty good job at pushing traffic towards Path of Exile. That's pretty much their claim to fame, is making this indie developer game as successful as it could be. They were really trying as hard as possible to get people off of Diablo and into Path of Exile. I think they've probably done a pretty good job of it. But yeah, StarCraft 2's case is more unique in the sense that nobody actually wants to make an RTS anymore. So StarCraft 2, just like if you're a casual that only likes 3D or dev games, there is no competition for StarCraft 2. There's nothing. There probably never will be.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a continuation of the RTS genre, not in a like a AAA sense. It's not going to ever hit the mainstream. It's just a game that's like it's too. I think the game itself demands a level of complexity that most people don't feel like interfacing with, and that's why MOBAs
Yeah.
and MOBAs
Especially
have.
modern people.
Yeah, I mean, they prefer those types of games. So since that's where the market demand is, there's not really much of a demand for the more of a complex games like RTSs, and the people who are demanding that are much more niche. So they're just going to go and stick to old games or custom content for those old games. That's really where
You
it
know,
is.
there has been the odd person who's tried to claim to me that Dota is an RTS.
Yeah, because
I
when
wish I was
you're
joking.
when when your fucking Russian teammates quit the game, you can control them too.
But yeah, that's a part of the evolution that made Dota successful. For one, Warcraft 3 failed competitively and it failed as a game. Warcraft 3 was such an absolute utter failure that it funneled all these people into this map. And then that map was really easy to play, but it was still competitive because there were so many people playing it.
Right.
So this is a really unique observation because then that created, the indie games to come after it, and then the actual games to come after it, and then, kind of like tower defense was sort of similar as well. Tower defense was just maps in these games, and then that turned into actual games, and then, well, you don't really hear about it anymore because nobody tried to do anything interesting with it afterwards. But for a time, there was a lot of games showing up that were tower defense. I would say most notably is probably Dungeon Defenders, which was a small Unreal 3 project that eventually went commercial. Unfortunately, they fucked it up with microtransactions. But for a time, it was actually, like, again, another kind of cutesy game that was actually enjoyable to play. And I would say I've spent probably about 200, 300 hours playing Dungeon Defenders quite extensively in co-op. And it's weird to, like, know that I'm playing a fucking game that originated as a map primarily from Warcraft 3 because Warcraft 3 was such a bad fucking game and had no competitive draw to it whatsoever other than Blizzard's funded tournaments, which were very, very, very niche in the kind of players that they attracted because so much of the game's races and stuff were just, and the strategies were just not competitively viable. And it was such a slow and dull game to watch. Blizzard kept funding those tournaments for quite some time, but especially after Frozen Throne, the game just didn't have a competitive scene. And then came Dota, and that taught a lot of people that they could be competitively viable without actually being gamers, without actually being good. So that's why you had a lot of people, like, basically you had StarCraft 2, which was also a disaster, and anybody who wasn't at the top of the food chain for competitive scene just immediately switched to either League of Legends or Dota 2. Because there they could be competitive without actually being good at the game. There they can make money and have way more exposure because they're not playing a dead game like StarCraft 2, while also being bad because they're not good players because they couldn't be successful at StarCraft 2. And it's just so much easier for them, so they just instantly migrated. I saw them in fucking droves just on Team Liquid alone. Just, this guy's switching to Dota 2, this guy's switching to League of Legends, and they're all like C and B, level players. Everybody who wasn't making a living off of being at the absolute top of the food chain of StarCraft 2. And then even then, a lot of the top of the food chain eventually went that direction anyways, just because they realized that they could make more money off of streaming than they could have been off of winning the handful of tournaments Blizzard was handing now.
Well, that's the thing is, I think that Warcraft 3 was probably insanely popular for its time because of the hype that Blizzard had going into that game's development. And
Yep.
then they were there, they bought the game, they were playing it, and they were like, this isn't satisfying, but I already paid for the game. And so some of them became mappers, and a lot of them became players of those maps. And sort of like how the whole ecosystem sort of developed is I guess it also that game attracted a different kind of player, an RPG, a weird like top-down RPG player, similar to Diablo but with even less interaction. And so I think it's very bizarre that it ended up happening at all. But yeah, a lot of the maps in that game ended up taking off compared to the core RTS gameplay because it was such a disaster. And it's still technically played professionally now, especially with the Reforged announcement. People have been going back to it, but I don't think it's going to be a big hit. I mean that's sort of like the I guess the final test of our year or our millennium, whether or not RTSs are profitable, as the chat is currently talking about, is if the Reforged can work without being saddled with microtransactions and still be profitable enough for Blizzard. But profitable for Blizzard and profitable for any other company are completely different things because Blizzard has so much bloat in their development that they waste so much money and they spend so much of it on marketing as well that they have to make it back with these microtransactions because nobody's going to pay for their games at the insane prices that they would have to charge in order to be profitable. So really the changes have to come from the development side of the game before it even releases. And it's that if you want to avoid microtransactions in your released AAA products and charge a reasonable price, which is obviously way less than the AAA price charges of $60 to $80, then you need to have a way more sound development cycle that doesn't take a crazy amount of money because you don't know how to manage your people and you don't know how to direct your assets and stuff. So it really just ends up being a massive disaster from the ground up when these companies have this incredibly inefficient development cycle for a game, and then they charge way more than the game is worth, or they go free to play, one or the other. And either way, they're still including loot boxes. And it's just, depending on whether or not it was free to play, determines how aggressively they push those loot boxes and the gambling side of things and all this other stuff. And now companies are realizing, hey, we can make even more money potentially with these mobile products, which obviously cost way less for us to develop, even with our really inefficient systems. And we can also charge way more for loot boxes. We can include loot boxes way more, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I find it fucking crazy how games are now more expensive than they've ever been since the N64 era that I can remember. And yet they cost less to develop overall, like in terms of the actual content. The content itself is so easy to get because it's you either just buy it like most companies do, or you have your pick of the litter of whatever artist you want, and you can just buy low, sell high. And games are shorter than they've been. They have less content than they've been ever been. And developers still have that incentive to throw in microtransactions because they're so fucking greedy. It's just absolutely crazy when people try to defend that kind of scummy ass behavior. And that's exactly why we're in this kind of pit hole right now where it's like, yeah, an RTS is definitely not competitively viable because what makes it good at RTS is its longevity, how it can adapt on its own without the developer constantly fucking meddling around and adding things to it, how it can evolve and grow on its own. Like, take Brood War. Brood War is pretty much just setting an example what makes a good RTS, not because it's necessarily a good game, because in many respects it isn't, but because Blizzard hasn't really interacted with it and it had such a strong competitive following to it, it continues to grow and evolve to this day. But that's not really profitable because not too many people are going to be buying Brood War anymore. Even with the remastered version, which by all extents is a complete disaster and only pushed people further away from Blizzard's sales, you know, Brood War is not successful today, but you can't make this argument that Brood War wasn't successful, financially speaking, because it most certainly was. But if you're looking at something that's going to be perpetually raking in, X figure every single day for the next 2 or 3 years before you release your next cycle, then the RTS is probably not ideal for that. Because, first of all, you have to establish that player base. And StarCraft came at a time where such a player base did exist, so it could be financially successful because you are accessing a very, very large number of people, even if your product was more like difficult to them than the average game released at the time. The fact is the RTS genre was really quite alive back then. Now, not so much. because the market is so much different now than it was like 20 years ago. People aren't looking to be challenged in games anymore. People aren't looking to be engaged anymore. People want instant gratification. People don't have standards. This is precisely why loot boxes and buying skins and shit is so successful, because even if only like 1% of your players is actually willing to spend that much money, that 1% gives you such a huge fucking return on how much you invested into it. It just makes perfect sense from a business standpoint to invest like $10, $20 commissioning an artist to scribble together a JPEG in a day, and then selling that at like $10 a bang, and then getting like, you know, I don't know actual numbers, but let's say, let's see if I can pick up. Actually, I want to see some numbers. I did read off some sales numbers, I believe, for Fate Grand Order and other games
Yeah,
on
that
the
was in
phone.
the Magic Trick one.
In the I told you guys what the prices were. I just actually want to see if I can grab a number on how many people actually play these overall. So, well, Fate Grand Order has grossed more than 3 billion in worldwide revenue. So, Fate Grand Order is basically no more advanced than Brood War in terms of its graphics. I think they might be using Live 2D for its sprites. And Light 2D can be kind of difficult to animate for, but its animations are extraordinarily primitive. Like, Brood War's animations are much more advanced. So, like I was detailing before, the prices for getting servants and stuff in there and the chances and things like that is absolutely insane for basically no real gain. Like a day's worth of work from somebody who actually knows their shit. And that's absolutely insane.
Right. Well,
Like,
even with the bloated development cycle of a modern game, it does not take even anywhere close to like $3 billion or whatever to make a
no.
game. Obviously, so
Oh, no.
when they say $3 billion in revenue, it's true that that doesn't necessarily
It's
it's
insane.
equal profit, but it's probably the vast majority of that is profit because there's no way that even a drop in the bucket would pay for the entire game's development many times over. So
I mean, Fate Grand Order, even if you consider, like, if they were, like, a lot of these games actually will just commission people off of Pixiv or whatever to do their art. And they'll just commission, like, random voice actors or whatever to do, like, random idols or whoever to do their voices.
yeah,
Like, that, even if that's really expensive, you can't see Fate Grand Order really costing that much money. Like, we're not talking about even millions here. We're talking like maybe tens to hundreds of thousands at the absolute maximum, provided they spend their money wisely.
yeah,
And these are built on pre-built engines like CryEngine and Unity and stuff are very common, so those licenses can be pricey, but the actual assets and stuff like that don't really take that much time at all, and they don't cost that much.
yeah. So you don't
So
even really need that much capital to get started working on a game like
no,
this. You're basically done as soon as the word go because of the fact that it's such a
Azure Land started very small. Hold on here, let's see if Wikipedia tells me how Azure Land started, because Azure Land was extremely tiny. Um, Launched in China September 2017. I don't know if it'll tell me. I don't know like actually how small it was, but I believe yes. A well-known Azure Lane's Yuan, a well-known uploader to the Chinese video site Bilibili, began developing the game with 5 of his college friends, with the initial notion of creating a Dojin game, if a commercial one is not possible. Seeing many similar games created by Greater China Kantai Collection, the developers aimed to create something different, yada yada yada, turn-based strategy, and then they changed and stuff like that. So it was very similar to like Counter Strike, where Counter Strike was like 2 guys or something in college or something like that.
yeah.
And so Azure Lane was very very small, very very small. Now that is 2017, and today it's going to have an anime adaptation. I have seen countless photos of conventions and stuff like that where they have idols selling merchandise for their game, like walls and walls and walls of boxes, like PVC figures and stuff. And like it's fucking enormous. Like it's definitely one of the top games right now, and it's not that old. It's not that old at all. And it's kind of a mess for English because there's mistranslations and shit all over the place. There are update schedules all over the goddamn place. There's constant weird shit happening all the time because it's not really being quality assured. but it's not really that old. And it started very small. These guys weren't even really thinking it would even really be that commercially successful. And then bam, it's fucking enormous. It's huge. It's huge in English, it's huge in China, it's huge in Japan. It's fucking enormous. And it's not even that big of a game. There's not really that much in it. And like it's basically one of those cases where if you figure out the formula to make something successful, it has a chance to really take off. So one of the reasons why Azur Lane owes a lot of success is very similar to Dota. Actually, Kantai Collection had a lot of very undesirable things in it, but was already like that served that niche of that kind of a game with that kind of a appeal, ship girls and stuff like that. Azur Lane was much more casual in a way because I believe Kantai Collection actually has like permanent death and stuff like that for units, which Azur Lane doesn't. Azur Lane is also much more friendly for gacha. You basically get free to play and get pretty much everything besides the skins. Unlike a lot of other games, like take for example Fate Grand Order, where you can save for a year and not get a single fucking thing like I did. So it's sort of like breaking away from the trends, but very importantly, feeding off of a market that existed, that was hungering for something like that. And that was what StarCraft owed a lot of its success to as well. The Korea story is very interesting, how their economy is really struggling. And then StarCraft comes along, and somehow by some interaction with Kespa and stuff like that, it becomes televised. It becomes really, really circular towards a lot of young Koreans who get sponsored, enter these houses. They train very, very extensively. It becomes a real full-time job for them. You know, like their entire culture really seemed to be integrated with StarCraft for a time. It really seemed to be like in a way you could even see it as their national sport. At least in terms of like the digital thing, it was definitely like a very prominent digital presence. So that for that to exist, the market had to have been wanting for it to exist. To look at an RTS today, that market doesn't exist anymore. Those kinds of people don't exist anymore because they have been driven away from gaming. There's so many people I've heard say things like, "Oh, I'm not really enjoying games anymore. I must be too old for games, too old to enjoy games." Because they think that the problem is that they've aged and they've matured too much to enjoy entertainment, which is an absolutely ridiculous notion altogether. But the fact that people are thinking like that, they're subconsciously realizing that new games just aren't good. But that's because, in large part, because new games aren't even made for thinking people to begin with. They're not made for that generation of people who actually really wanted content out of their games. Like, look at fucking Perfect Dark and Time Splitters, which is basically Perfect Dark 2. Look at these shooters that have bot support in them. And then Time Splitters had like custom maps and shit. And Perfect Dark, you had the single player campaign, but then you had all this shit related to the challenges and the bots and stuff like that, and all different game types and the maps and stuff like that. I couldn't even regale how many thousands of hours I put into that game. As a shooter, not playing online, like this is the N64, not playing online, not playing with people, just playing with bots. The only game I can think of that really comes close to that is Counter-Strike 1.6 and a little bit with Source, where they did have bot support, but it really wasn't amazingly good. And it really depended upon third-party maps and stuff like that. Like the actual integration for stuff like that really wasn't amazingly good. It did exist though. It did exist. But in order to get bot support for 1.6 and Team Fortress Classic and stuff like that, you're largely relying on third parties. So in order for those systems to exist, you had to have people that are interested enough to actually develop for them. And that's what back when I was playing on like an M-Cyrix 2 and shit like that. But now times have changed, and how many fucking shooters can you think of that actually have real single player support with bots? So there is Killzone. Killzone maybe 2. I'm not sure about 2, but 3 does kind of have it, but it's very jank and very limited. It's very, very limited and clearly thrown as an afterthought. Counter-Strike Go has it, but the Counter-Strike Go bots aren't even as good as the ones in Counter-Strike Source. Halo most certainly didn't have it. And pretty much none of these games they're really going to see in terms of shooters today really emphasize that longevity in single player. The single player is always just thrown as an afterthought. It's always about trying to gamble on the latest fad for multiplayer. First, it was things like Call of Duty. That's why Titanfall had so many problems, because Titanfall was a game about titans. It was a mix of infantry and vehicular combat. Well, people didn't want vehicular combat. Turns out they just wanted to play Call of Duty, so they destroyed that game. And then he got into DayZ, which was an absolute disaster, but got people into the whole battle royale fad. So now shooters are generally they just have to have battle royale in them. Even Tetris has fucking battle royale now.
Don't say that.
Like the zombie fads as well. Like the closest you're really going to get to single player support is really going to be Left 4 Dead. As far as like semi-modern shooters are concerned. Like that's because the market is different. Like developers may be incredibly greedy, but if they have marketers that say, hey, the audience really wants this, you need to make this to be really competitive today, they're going to at least try to do that to be competitively viable. Marketers are telling Blizzard, hey, you could spend $100 million, $200 million trying to make an RTS you don't know how to make. You've proven you don't know how to make. And you can get some gains out of it. You could probably make a profit, but it's going to be difficult. Or you could put in $10 into Joachim TG using a Unity license that Ass Invasion is forcing down our throat because we can't get our stuff to perform properly on consoles and phones. And you could make millions of dollars off of literally doing fucking nothing. Like, from a business perspective, it's a no-brainer. You're always going to go for what is the least amount of work, least amount of investment for the biggest returns, which is going to be mobile probably for quite a while. And in Japan, apparently, it's much more significant of a thing than it is even in the US. Like, in the US, it's like basically everything's a fucking mobile port now. Even Nintendo's new console is just a glorified phone. And in Japan, it's still more significant than that, to the point that a lot of the developers of more classic, noteworthy Japanese games have left their parent companies and are now independently producing, like, derivatives of their old work for mobile. Like, I think that was a thing for maybe Castlevania and some other stuff.
Well, Blizzard's been doing that with their remasters anyway, so it's sort of the same thing,
Yeah.
except they aren't extending it to mobile yet. So.
Well, mobile has already become so fucking crowded.
Well, yeah, that's
Like,
one
if
of the
you
things I was going
want
to say.
compete-
When you were talking about the Azure Lane stuff, you're talking about how they basically use the same mechanism we were discussing when it comes to competition with Blizzard titles, and how there is no competition most of the time.
Yeah.
And they saw that there was an area where people didn't have much competition, but they still wanted something that was different, and so they made something that was hopefully serving that niche, and they got rewarded massively for it. You don't really see too much opportunity for that now, I don't think.
It all comes down to luck. Like, were people really thinking that Battle Royale was going to become a thing?
No.
And then DayZ hit and it was a fucking joke, and then you suddenly ended up with PUBG, which was basically DayZ 2. And then suddenly Battle Royale became massive. And it just so happened that Epic was working on Fortnite, and then that took off because PUBG was really bad and people got sick of it. And then he had his performance on the X-Bone that just became legendary. That fucking video where everything is like a 2x2 pixel on the screen for like half the game. And like, nobody really saw that coming. Nobody really saw Dota coming either. Certainly nobody saw Azure Lane coming. Like, it just really comes down to finding that one thing that somehow exists, but you just somehow kind of fall into it. That's why companies have marketing teams, is to kind of try to predict those trends, to try to get ahead of their, anyone else potentially discovering it. But a lot of them just seem like completely fucking accidental.
Bitcoin. The thing about the whole simplicity increasing in these games, like you were talking about, where like Azure Lane was successful in part because of the fact that it was more casual and you had less thinking going on. You also spoke about the fact that people feel like they're outgrowing games, and that's just because the games that they like are no longer being made, really.
Basically.
I think that's in large part due to the fact that it's not profitable to make games that are challenging to people.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why even the UED commander in the chat mentioned Apex Legends was a stripped down version of Titanfall, and yet it was massively successful. Like you mentioned Titanfall having this vehicular combat. It also has that weird movement system where you can like parkour around stuff. Yeah. And like the Battle Royale thing, Apex Legends, doesn't have any of that. Doesn't have the Titans, doesn't have the parkour system. it has some class systems or something. It has some weird shit where you sort of like Overwatch or whatever, where you're picking a different class that you're going to use, but it doesn't actually have anything that defines it as Titanfall even. And I think that's because it was just sort of like all of these other, a lot of the other games that you see that are loosely connected to a franchise. It's just, oh yeah, it's battle royale linked to this franchise because otherwise maybe we'll lose out on some marketing. You know, this is crazy.
Well,
But
a lot
yeah,
of cases, people just want to change their franchise name just because there's negative connotations to it. Like I've seen that as well. I can't remember. There was one really great example, but there's companies like I believe it might have been Atari or it was Activision who literally named their company in a certain way just so that they be listed alphabetically higher.
oh yeah, well,
There's insanity like that everywhere.
anytime somebody brings up alphabetical listings, I just get reminded of one of the worst maps that ever got featured in the top 10 of one of the Blizzard mapping contests for StarCraft 2. And because it was the first, like alphabetically, it was the first one, it was like top three, even though it was the worst one of the top 10, like number 10 out of 10. People voted for it because it was the first one. Like, that's so insane
Yep.
to me.
That's how it works. That is literally how it works.
Yeah. So I don't know, man. I think that the fact that it has basically nothing from Apex Legends, that it has almost no defining characteristics from Titanfall. You know, chat saying it has guns or it's named after it or whatever, but there's the things that made Titanfall different than Call of Duty are not present in Apex Legends. And so when you look at it that way, it's like, okay, well, now we're making something that's not only is it battle royale, so it's automatically like, you know, appealing to that lowest common denominator. We're stripping out the things that made the lowest common denominator uncomfortable with the franchise as a large at large.
Yeah.
So I think that has something to do with it for sure. And Baythal does bring up a good point where he says that complex or challenging games might be profitable. It's just that they aren't profitable enough for executives and investors. Like that's sort of what I was trying to get at is like,
well, let's look at Blizzard for a second.
yeah.
Like what I mentioned before is that it is quite legal in America to sue a company if they cost you money as an investor. And a little while ago, someone had posted a link in here where there is actually a class action against Blizzard right now because of Bungie leaving, and they didn't go through the proper channels to inform their investors, and then their stocks went down, and now that's grounds for a class action. And there's a huge fucking lawyer like that. The lawyer behind that is quite significant. They're just basically they're like fucking calling out the whistle and saying, "Hey, you invested money into here at this point in time. You're ready to be joining this class action." And you know, CEOs and executives, they don't give two fucks about what's a good product or what isn't a good product. They have to answer to their investors, and their investors say, "You're going to make us money, and you're going to do whatever the fuck you got to do. You're going to murder your own mother to make us money, or we're going to find someone who will." There's a lot of cases where they can just flat out just replace you if they don't like you. No, maybe you're like Mike Morhaime and you get a bonus of what, like $30 million or something fucking insane like that, and people still have the gall to call your company good, and you just kind of like walk away and set for life, you know, multiple lives. But in a lot of cases, you don't just want to get ousted from whatever it is you're doing because you decided to make a risk, you know, for your investors. So once you have willfully entered that waterworks, you basically absolve yourself of any attachment to actually making a high quality product. You no longer care about the quality of the product. You no longer care about the product at all. You basically care only about what the marketers tell you to do, and that's it.
Well, yeah, because what you're
Because
after is
if you fuck up, you're in
profitability.
trouble.
Well, yeah, you're after profitability and you're after not getting sued. And so it's just a real weird network of insanity. But what it comes down to is the fact that most people either don't or can't have the passion required to make something that is a quality product and yet not as
No.
profitable as some of these loot box infested mobile lights. So it's like you don't really have that many opportunities these days as a large developer. You know, if you want to make a RTS, for example, you're not really going to be a large developer in that case. It's suicide because your product won't be good, and it will be infested with loot boxes, because that's what your investors require in order to, well, that's what you are required to put in the game in order for it to be profitable enough for your investors not to sue you, as you're saying, or not to get mishappy in general.
Because it's not just about like, oh, my product was successful like my last product. It is your product has to be more successful than the last product.
Right, yeah. Well, that's the other thing is you don't have it's not even just that you have to continue making profitable titles. It's that you have to build upon that profitability. In some cases, it's a completely unrealistic expectation because they're, especially if you get to the point where you're like Apex Legends is right now, where it's an insane amount of players. Like if you wanted to follow that up with Apex Legends 2 Electric Boogaloo, how the fuck are you going to get more players than even exist for in that market
space? You need to do what Blizzard did with Brood War. You need to kill it.
Yeah.
You need to take the axe to every possible outlet you can, and you need to kill it.
Well, that's not even it.
Precisely what Blizzard did.
I just mean, like, yes, you would have to kill your original game, but I'm just talking about, like, okay, let's talk about making a sequel and having it hit bigger numbers of consumers, of players, of daily sign-ins, whatever. The only way that that's even possible is to, like, I don't even, you would have to somehow appeal to more players than before, presumably. But if your game is already at, like, the Call of Duty entrance, like, it's like people say that you're at death's door. You're at the on the porch of Call of Duty, about to enter into that space because you're that stripped down. Then obviously you're going to be in a position where you don't really have much else you can do to make it more accessible to people.
You have to really understand your game. Like, you have to understand your game in and out and why people go to it. And that is more work than developers are willing to do. You will be hard-pressed to find a developer who actually understands their own game. You won't find it in Blizzard. You won't find it in EA. You won't find it in Activision. None of these developers play their own games or understand why they're enjoyable. That's why you see something that was, pretty successful, like, say, Titanfall, when it launched, had a lot of potential in it, but then they stripped out a lot of stuff to feed a very vocal minority, and they ended up killing Titanfall. And then they alienated the people who are actually, like, interested in the unique features it had. So, like, there's a lot of, like, missed opportunities like that. So the developer really has to understand what's successful, and that's not safe. Like, either. Like, that's not safe. That's not a safe business plan. If you wanted to make you want to make the second installation and make it as successful, that's not as safe as just finding ways to prolong one and just keep it alive as long as possible and keep milking it.
Yeah, but this is like a backwards thing anyways, because if you're doing it right, your game will last, even if you make a sequel. Something like Brood Wars outlasted StarCraft 2, very obviously. Like, that's a very easy example. Yeah. But if you're playing your cards right and you're not trying to chase that, yes, they do. And they sort of admitted it though when they went back to remaster it. And the same thing with Warcraft 3. Like, they're admitting that their old games are better because they're going back and updating them instead of developing new ones. Yeah. So it's just it's a sham. But when you look at it that way, it's like, okay, we've got this problem. I guess the problem is we need to make even more money than we're already making. I guess that's your issue. Okay, so how are you going to move on from there to working with a new game without sabotaging your old one like Blizzard did, where they just kill Brood War, or attempt to anyways. And like, the only thing I can think of is that you have to just be okay with the original game still existing and being profitable and possible. And then you have to try, if you want to make a sequel, then you have to really, like you said, know the game, figure out ways to improve that formula, and just make it so that they're competing on the marketplace like two games normally would, where you just say, hey, you got this game over here. It's a couple years old or however old it is, and it's got these flaws. We think we've corrected them and done a bunch of different things over with the sequel. Check it out. And people will decide for themselves if they like it or not. But people are so afraid of doing that because I think in large part it's like this weird cycle where the development cycles are so overblown. They're way too bloated in terms of their cost and in terms of the number of people involved in these productions. And then you get into this issue where it's so risky to make a game or even to make movies and some other mediums. Like, it's so expensive. And then you go to having an issue with, like, okay, I have this insanely expensive development cycle. I have to make this profitable, or then I'm not going to get my investors to stick with me and not sue me and do all these other things. And so you have that in the back of your head. Like these are all external to just making a goddamn game. Like this has nothing to do with actually making a game. So of course these developers lose sight of what it actually is to make a game because everything that they're dealing with on a daily level is it's not compartmentalized. It's not just hey the team leads will manage that and sort of just like guide the developers. It's always like breathing down their necks like hey if this game isn't profitable then your job could be at stake, we could lay you off and replace you with 100 other people because that's what we do at Blizzard. So it's insane that this is the ecosystem of the games industry right now where we have insanely bloated and over too many cooks in the kitchen, too expensive development cycles. We have these issues where our developers are worried about satisfying marketers instead of making games and satisfying consumers. And obviously, on top of it, there's also some very demonstrably easy ways to make money off of these like mobile games and these battle royales and stuff, and that are a lot safer than going out and developing a real title, quote unquote. Putting real money into a title like I don't know what an RTS, for example, like we've been talking about. So
Yeah, the shape of the industry is so depressing, and there's such an easy, obvious way to fix it, which is just stop buying games that are bad. But this market's been kind of groomed to get to this point. It didn't grow overnight, it's been shaped to this point. Developers have released progressively lazier and lazier and lazier and lazier shit. And people have just apologized more and more and more and more and more. And now we've gotten to the point where Blizzard and EA and Bethesda are just blatantly telling you, you're our fucking sheep, give us money and fuck off. And people are still apologizing for them, even now. Like, that is so fucking insane that people are still giving Blizzard money, that people are still giving Bethesda money. They just haven't fucking deserved it for 15 plus years. And even when they're literally laughing in your fucking face, you're still giving them money and still apologizing for them. When all you have to do is just say, give us a quality product or we won't give you our money. And then that will push because then the developers will tank, people will lose jobs, and only developers who actually produce quality products that get your money will receive investment necessary to actually be financially successful. And that doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen because not enough people stop and think, maybe I should stop funding fucking shitty products. Maybe I should stop fucking saying, oh, well, this is enough for me when it wasn't enough for me 20 fucking years ago. Not enough people stop and think, it isn't that I'm getting too old for games, it's that this fucking market is trash.
well,
Not
there's
enough
also the
people
fact that
stop and think.
the younger audience is also growing up in this, so they have never known a better state either.
They
So it's
never know and they're unwilling to know. Like, how many fucking people have been resistant to just playing something that's difficult? Like, let's even just take a really really subjective example of Dark Souls. Dark Souls is not a difficult game, but there's so many people who actually own Dark Souls but don't actually play it because they want to identify as someone who plays hard games, but they're actually not even willing to play Dark Souls, even though they're identifying it as a part of the crowd because they're actually really really scared of failure. They're actually really really scared of being told by a game to actually improve. And Dark Souls is actually incredibly easy. Anybody can beat Dark Souls. There's nothing difficult about it whatsoever. All it requires you is just to fucking pay attention. And people can't even do that. That's why we have all these fucking phone games and MTG for jocks and all that stuff is really, really heavily based on RNG. Because you can always just blame RNG to be successful rather than blaming yourself. And that's what leads to toxicity in multiplayer games because it's easier to blame your teammates or hacks or lag or something than it is to blame yourself for being bad because you lost a match. And you have those two fucking sides where people don't actually want to play difficult games, but when they do play something that's difficult, they tend to try to divert the blame away from themselves. Whereas back in say Japan and PC Engine and arcades and stuff, it really was like you didn't get anything for being successful. You just got a higher score. And that drove so much in just terms of like the game sales and the player base and stuff like that. was just to become better, was just to see self-improvement. I mean, even in modern games and in semi-modern games, you still kind of see that, because there is a lot of people who play like DMC and stuff for the sake of producing like perfect combos or new kinds of combos or whatever. Like, they're well past the point where the game on the hardest difficulty will even provide the semblance of a challenge. It's all just about making combo masturbation videos. But there's still a lot of people who do that because the technical finesse required for some of the execution takes a long time of getting used to. And there's still people who play like DMC3, which is PlayStation 2, and it's ancient. And yes, it's a good game, but it has lots of problems with it, and it's not very challenging. And it's not going to be challenging to these people at all. They're way past the point where it's just come down to just technical execution of perfect combos, perfect air combos, air canceling, keeping enemies in the air for like minutes at a time, like just really, really insane shit because they want to challenge themselves to do this. So you see all over the place, like there's still trickles of that audience that still wants things to be difficult, that still wants to be engaged by things, and then they end up going to things like Dark Souls because it's like the only fucking game franchise that doesn't hand you an ocean of QTEs and is willing to kill you for not paying attention, as opposed to all these other fucking RPGs I've played, these horrible, awful, disgusting excuses of games that will happily kill you for the dumbest of fucking reasons, like enemies hitting you like 20 meters below you. Lords of Shadow, Dante's Inferno, God of War, all these games are fucking terrible. They will kill you not because they're even remotely difficult, but because they're so fucking badly designed. But they're the games with the more successful marketing. Lords of Shadow has the Castlevania logo on it. Is that anything to do with Castlevania? No. And God of War was more successful than Devil May Cry because it was American. And what's weird about Devil May Cry is Devil May Cry 1 was criticized for being too difficult by Americans, and it was not a difficult game. Not even compared to like DMC3, it was not nearly as difficult. And it was apparently criticized heavily for being difficult. And then God of War came out, which is basically Devil May Cry Cargo Cult. And instead of difficulty, they had QuickTime events. God of War
Man.
was a far more successful franchise. And that's like insane. Like the whole evolution of all that is just absolutely fucking nuts. Because Devil May Cry originated as Resident Evil. Devil May Cry 1 is literally like a patched together Resident Evil. And the controls in it are 1,000 times better than almost any other action RPG you're going to play to the present day. But then a lot of DMC developers went into Platinum Games, and their call to fame is carnival games and QuickTime events. Literally the shit that they had avoided doing in DMC all the way until they left Capcom. Now that's all they fucking do. They don't even make games anymore. They make carnival and QuickTime events. Every fucking thing Platinum Games has published has been a fucking disaster. Bayonetta was the closest you're gonna get to DMC, but it's got fucking QuickTime events all over the fucking place. And it performs like shit. Metal Gear Rising is a disaster. Nier Automata is a disaster. Like, for a developer who had produced DMC that seemed to have gotten things right to make a difficult game that's about execution and stuff, but they just needed more budget and more time to actually do it, they just went straight down the shitter. And then that made them more successful. Like, people just need to stop and think, maybe we should ask people to actually make gameplay instead of QuickTime events. And when they make QuickTime events and not gameplay, we don't give them our fucking money. And we say, hey, how about you make a good game? Then you get our money. Then the developer will think, shit, I'm going to lose my job if I don't make a good game. So I'm going to sit down, I'm going to put my head together with my interns, we're going to make a good game, and we're going to make some money.
Yeah, basically the rewards incentive has to go from avoiding lawsuits from investors by virtue of implementing loot boxes to avoiding lawsuits from investors by satisfying the customer, which is really weird.
Like, the entire investor thing itself is insane.
Yeah.
Like, I find the whole concept insane that you get invested in when you haven't even proven yourself. Like you are sitting on this padding of money that you don't fucking deserve. It's like Patreon and Scamstarter and GoFundMe, all this shit. None of these people deserve a fucking dime from it. Now, you're going to talk about platforms. I'll talk to you guys about a platform I know pretty well. It's called Roll20. So Roll20 is for Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop stuff. Basically, you go on a web page, you go into this laggy as fuck editor, you slap images and sounds and shit together. You call it a tabletop game. You roll some dice. You play some waifus. You stab some goblins. Whatever. It's D&D for neckbeards without having to pay like $800 fucking dollars for miniatures and shit. So the whole concept is you can do this all on the webpage, so it's convenient and fast. You can do it with people over the internet. That's great and fantastic. These guys got $80,000 fucking dollars to make this. And they don't use OpenGL or WebGL, whatever it's called, for anything other than the dice. So anything that's not displayed to the players that's on GM layer is still being rendered for players, and it performs like shit. I've heard from many different sources that it wasn't even usable for years until very, very recently. Most browsers and system configurations couldn't even load the fucking thing. They don't allow you to use external hosting for your images. I can't, like, for example, use my websites or Imager or any of these other freely available sources that let you use images wherever the fuck you want of any size. I can't use those on Roll20. I've got to use their fucking limit of 100 megabytes. 100 megabytes is supposed to service your campaign on tabletop. Now, keep in mind, you're uploading images for your players' portraits, profiles, anything you want in the journal, your tokens for your monsters, items, maps, which are huge, everything like that. You're expected to do that within 100 megabytes or pay a fee. So here's the thing. They lock you into that fee. They say, hey, you want to actually use the service, you've got to pay monthly. It's a fucking subscription, which, by the way, a lot of production software has gone, and everybody fucking hates it. It's terrible. But because this is the thing, it locks you into it because you've got to use this fucking software. If you want to be making a game today, in all likelihood, you're going to be using Autodesk software. And you're probably going to be using Adobe software as well. Now, unless you're intelligent and you're using a cracked version and not telling anyone, like basically everybody in the fucking industry at a certain point does, or you're using something that's for some reason locking you into a modern version, so you have to use the new versions, you're actually paying like upwards of like hundreds of dollars a month just to be able to run these programs at all. It's no longer I pay an insane license or take advantage of a student license and use this program. It's I have to pay monthly to do fucking anything to even do my job. So they've locked people into that because you have to do it, because you have to use these programs, you have to use these formats. These are the only programs that'll do it. You know, Autodesk owns Maya and 3ds Max, and those are like the two major modeling applications you're going to see. There's like Houdini and stuff coming up as well, but Maya and 3ds Max are really the big ones. Autodesk owns them both. And they've gone straight to shit. And then, you know, Adobe owns basically everything. Adobe actually bought Substance. Now, if you're not familiar with Substance is basically what every single fucking company does to make their textures. You may have noticed after a certain point in like the PlayStation 3 era that all these like photorealistic quote unquote games all basically look exactly the same. They all have like that shiny metallic subsurface or screen space reflection-y look to them. All the grass and stuff all kind of looks the same and stuff like that. That's because they're all generated with Substance Designer. They're all using the exact same software, and they're all using the exact same presets within that software. Previously, in order to use that software and Substance Painter, which allows you to paint these textures on the things with UVs, you know, pretty powerful software. In order to use that before, you basically had to have a license. And the license said, hey, you can use this program however fucking long you want. And this license is good until, you know, we release a new version. So the way a lot of this software is because it's feature complete. Like Photoshop has been feature complete for years. You know, it's hard to make money off of something that's feature complete, right? Because you don't have a reason to push a new version of this product. Well, Substance Designer did have new reasons because they would introduce new functionality into the program because it was still relatively new kinds of software back then. Photoshop didn't. So they change the color of the user interface. They move a couple windows around. They throw on a new filter or two. They charge you another $1,000 or $2,000 for a new license. That's how we get bloat. That's one of the big problems with bloat and web pages and programs is it's been feature complete, but we still got to make money off of it somehow, or our company's going to die, right? Well, the other solution is to charge monthly. So Substance Designer and Substance Painter, Bitmap Material, they're all owned by Allegorithmic. Allegorithmic has just been acquired by Adobe. That's being brought into the Adobe family. They're going to be charging you monthly for that. Now, Allegorithmic did originally allow you to pay monthly if you really wanted to, but you didn't have to. You can have like what I have, for example, which is a Steam license. You can actually buy it on Steam, and I got it for like $100 or something. And it's like, I can launch this program whenever the fuck I want. I can make textures, I can make materials, I can literally import them one-to-one into like Unreal 4, and I have something that's PBR compliant. I literally have a tool set that can do me tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars of work, and I've paid like $100 for it. Like, that's how powerful this shit is. And that's, as a result, how mandatory it is to actually use this in game development. It's why game development is so cheap, because programs like Substance Designer and Substance Painter save you so much time by doing a lot of the really complicated stuff very, very quickly. As opposed to having to be an artist and having to sit down and draw out all my textures and draw out all my normal maps and draw out all my ambient occlusion, draw out all my specularity, draw all my, diffuse albedo, other stuff like that. This program generates it all for me using nodes. Just connecting the dots in nodes. So long as I at least have some idea of what these nodes actually do, I can connect the dots and maybe have a series of masks and base textures. I can make something that's been like, $10,000 worth of man hours to create by hand in like half an hour or two. Like these, I really recommend you look at these programs. They're insanely powerful. But now that's changed, or now it's locking you in. What does this have to do with Roll20? Roll20 is a service. They've already been paid $80,000 to produce a service that is very good and polished. That's the concept. But they've been paid before they provided any proof. So what they did instead is they say, okay, we're going to produce the most basic platform that does the most basic things that it says in the box. And then we're going to introduce a macro system that is like a scripting system, but it's only available to people who pay. And then we're going to let other people do all of the work for us, in which they're going to make all these macros and stuff that make the service usable for actual power users, and it's only available to people who pay. So they're making all the functionality for the software for us in our stead. So even though we were paid, we're not going to do our job at all. We're going to lock people into this service by encouraging the average user to use a subscription thing, because we won't allow you to use any external hosting for your images at all. So if you want to use this service for anything beyond just kind of fucking around as a DM, you basically have to subscribe, or you have to make multiple accounts, which is probably something they're going to drop the hammer on eventually when they actually wake up to it, because they're Reddit tards. They're not smart enough to realize that's what people are doing. So now we're in a situation where digital tabletop kind of really wasn't a big thing. You have Map Tool, which is local, but it doesn't have support for music. Roll20 had support for music, but they were using SoundCloud.
No way.
Yeah, they're using SoundCloud. Now, at some point, SoundCloud decided that they didn't like Roll20, so they're going to blacklist Roll20 out of their API. So everybody's music ceased to work. Now, a savior came along in the form of a site called Fanburst. Fanburst had none of the idiotic shit associated with SoundCloud, like, for example, 120-minute limit on your upload space. So you could do what I did. You can actually have a soundtrack for your game. You can upload like 16 gigabytes of music or whatever it is I have up there right now. Well, Fanburst this month announced that, oh yeah, we don't have any funding, so our site's shutting down. So, once again, everybody's music on the Roll20 platform is about to just fucking disappear. Music that if you're like me, you've spent like a year and a half putting together and sorting out. So you're actually losing a lot of data. So Fanburst has a few choices that they can make here. They, for example, could open up crowdfunding or take advantage of their advertisement revenue or something like that. Like there's a lot of ways this site could stay afloat that they're for some reason not taking advantage of. But given that Fanburst basically has had problems that like crippled the site for months at a time they never tried to fix, it's not really surprising that they're not actually interested in keeping it running. But if you're a person who's using Roll20, losing Fanburst is actually kind of a big deal because it's the only way for you to actually play music in your game right now. Until the Reddit tards in charge of Roll20 realized, wait a second, we've got all these people locked into our system because they're stuck paying or they're playing for free. But they're stuck here anyways because there really isn't an alternative if they haven't already gone to map tools, which requires it's map tools is hard to get into because there's a much more significant learning curve to it. To really take advantage of it, you need to know some kind of scripting language. I don't really know which one specifically, maybe like Python or something. But it's more powerful than Roll20, but it isn't nearly as easy to get into. So most of the people who are using Roll20 are basically locked into it because all their assets are on Roll20. They don't have external assets. So what Roll20 has decided to do, here's the fucking kicker. Their existing subscribers don't have the space to actually put audio in. They were going to put their own audio system in, but the existing subscribers only had a maximum of like a gigabyte of space or something. That's not enough for music and images. So they decided to increase the space that you could use on Roll20, but only for subscribers. So free users are still stuck with that 100 megabytes, which is absolutely worthless for images, much less images plus audio. Whereas if you are paying the highest tier of subscription, you get a grand total of 6 gigabytes. Storage is very, very cheap these days. Companies like Google, for example, have ISPs. They actually go through hard drives like fucking jet fuel because of failures, because of just how many hard drives they have. Like, space is really easy and cheap to get. And bandwidth isn't necessarily that cheap, depending on what it is you're doing and what your server load is. But rather than, for example, opening up their system in such a way which you could use a third-party service, for example, web space you're already paying for your images and your sound, thereby alleviating any and all load off of Roll20 completely, so it's actually cheaper for them. They decide to really just double down on locking people into their service and saying, hey, we're not even going to look for alternatives to Fanburst. We're going to say, if you can't subscribe to us, if you're not going to pay us money, you don't fucking get to use audio at all anymore. No, it's not necessarily Roll20's obligation to serve the, place of Fanburst, because Fanburst went belly up on their own. And nor do I expect them to give you unlimited audio hosting or something. But the fact that they don't even let you use external hosts at all is absolutely insane. And it's all a part of their strategy to lock people into their service. So again, we keep returning to this concept of locking people in, of forcing people into something, either by extent if they already put so much time into it or whatever. We see that a lot in games as well. That's a big strategy that World of Warcraft and other MMOs and phone games and stuff employ to lock you in, at least mentally. I have the daily systems and the repeating quests and the grinds and stuff like that. Once you've already invested time into it, it gets really, really hard to pull yourself out because you mentally think, shit, I've already put so much time and energy into this. I may as well see it through to the end, right? And when you throw in something that's time based in terms of how much money you pay, monthly subscriptions, that keeps the subscription model going, if not anything else. So that whole system from the get-go, like the very design of it, is really toxic. Because it's not about, I made a game, you're playing it because you enjoyed it. It's more like, I made a system that baited you into it because you thought it was going to be enjoyable, and now you feel obligated to finish it because you've already wasted so much time into it. It's like the gambler's fallacy. You see that a lot with gacha. Somebody spends $100, $200, $300 rolling for something they want in a waifu phone game. They don't get it. They think, oh, shit. I've already invested $300 fucking dollars into this. Let's throw another $30 at it and see. Because they've already invested so much money and they think, well, shit, my chances of getting it have got to be higher now because I've already failed so many times. They think that 2% becomes 50% if they keep throwing money at it, but that's not how it works. It's always going to be the same 2%, right? Like you can just keep fucking rolling. You feasibly could roll tens of thousands of times and never actually see that 2% because 2% doesn't automatically turn into 99% just because you rolled it however many times. Statistically speaking, you have so many rolls to get something, but that doesn't actually mean you're going to get it. So people come up with fucking excuses to justify throwing things at something, be it time or money or energy, whatever. And the developers realize this.
But didn't they already get paid $80,000 to make this platform?
Yep.
So what the fuck are they sitting here? What are they doing?
Nothing.
Where does their money come from? Where'd it go?
It went into cocaine and hookers. It certainly didn't go into the system. They haven't done any fucking actual updates to that shit in 2 years that I've used it. Instead, there's Chrome and Firefox add-ons that they have claimed compromise your account, which they don't. That do things like add dark theme, so you're not staring any fucking 255 white all day and bleeding out your eyes. They make the map list not a giant series of thumbnails you have to very slowly scroll through, and instead turn it into a table list. They do things like condense all these multiple tabs of options into one tab. You know, like basic user interface stuff. That the first time you actually use a service, you think, gee, this would be a lot better if we actually made better use of our screen space, right? But they don't think about that because they don't use their own platform. They merely saw digital tabletop as a potential avenue they could lock people into and steal money out of. The worst part of it all is there's actually people trying to apologize for this. There's actually people trying to defend them with some absolute fucking bizarre arguments like, if you spend $3 for a coffee a day, you can spend money for a subscription to an online service. That's their fucking defense.
Yeah, I sure can. And guess what? I'm not going to. Because why the fuck would I do that when you're not even doing your work? You already got paid for this, man. You didn't do your work.
It is crazy shit. Like, I can understand if they're like really strapped on money or whatever because they don't want to, offer all the storage. Why don't you just enable people to use fucking external hosting then? I have tons of web space. I could host 50,000 fucking games on my web space. I can't use any of it for this for no fucking reason. No actual legit reason other than just raw greed. That's all it is just raw greed on the, completely ignorant.
Listen, they probably got a lot of their shit from some freeware academic website on top of it, so the functionality, I'm sure, exists to plug in an external host. So it's not a fucking technical issue.
It's a very conscious decision they made to lock people in.
And you know what's really funny?
Locking people in is a really big thing.
Like, they were so short-sighted with their approach here, where they said, oh yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to lock people out of being able to use external hosts, because then they'll have to use our local hosts, which are more limited than their external hosts likely are, and then they'll have to pay subscriptions fees so that they can access an unlimited version of our local hosting. Yeah, and then nobody fucking uses your service, dude.
Nope. That's what they're doing, is they're just driving people away. They've pissed a lot of people off, especially people that have already paid for their service. Because,
of course,
like I said, even if you're paying for the top tier and you're getting 6 gigabytes, that's nothing compared to what you actually need. Because think about it. This isn't like a StarCraft campaign where you're sitting down and you're playing a map and you're like in a map for like an average maximum of, say, like an hour. These are games with multiple people that go on for hours at a time where campaigns can last years. The average dungeon master is going to want a lot of audio assets so that they have the ability to make soundscapes and music and stuff that doesn't get old listening to it for 5-6 hours of sitting, right? So there's a lot of people who have like hour-long sound mixes. There's a lot of people who use commercial CD, like wind sounds and stuff like that. Stuff that adds up to like minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes of audio. And the other thing is that even if you're a paying member, you actually can only upload a maximum of 20 megabytes per file. So you can't use any of these major files anyways.
Like, what the fuck? How do you do it then?
It's a completely arbitrary limit. I saw people complaining about that on their forum. Like, it's the most fucking bizarre shit.
Yeah, so if you wanted to like take something that you had
You're
made,
already paying for their service. You just can't use it the way you want. This is fucking nuts. Like, they basically shoot everybody in the foot. Even people who are apologizing for them, they still shoot it. Because they don't use their own service. Like, it's
no,
again, like, developers don't play their own game. People don't use their own service. Like, it was never about making an online platform that was suitable for people, that catered to their needs, that fulfilled the niche and the tool sets they were looking for. It was all about gaming the gullible. It was all about stealing money from people who are too stupid or too lazy to care. And they have driven a lot of people away. They've driven people off the platform. They've driven people to playing by hand. They've driven people to Map Tool. And unfortunately, Map Tool, as far as I read, the development on it has really died out, because a lot of people were like, oh shit, Roll20 came up and it's an easy service, and all people go to Roll20 instead of here because this takes some getting into. But then I read their forum, it's this influx of new people. It's like, hey, I'm coming from Roll20 and I want to use this, and how do I get into it, and so on and so forth. It's like,
yeah,
it's just, the whole thing is so fucking stupid, because, like, I'm not skilled enough to use Map Tool, and I'd rather not have to invest like half a year into figuring it out, because we're trying to make an Unreal 4 client, and who fucking knows how long it's going to take. But like, I don't want to invest all this time into learning another tool that I shouldn't need to learn, because the one tool should be enough. I have to redo a year and a half of organization and sorting because other people can't fucking do what they said they were going to do, and this other service would rather screw me out than help me actually run my games. And like, all this shit just serves you just to drive you away from dealing with public platforms over and over and over and over and over again. And again, there's no there's no real major competition. This is still a very young kind of thing. Digital tabletop has become huge since Roll20 came out, but that's because of stuff like the tabletop simulator and map tools and stuff like that, and Roll20. But in large part because of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Again, very casualified, very simplified versions of
yeah, yeah. It
Dungeons and
got
Dragons.
worse after, I think, up to a point after 2, it was just getting shit on. But I never
So
played
that
2.
like brought a lot of attention to it. So that led to like an explosion of like online presence for this. But as far as like digital platforms are concerned, it's a lot like YouTube, where you don't really have a lot of choices if you want to do things this way. And that is really bad, because it means that one service can do absolutely mind-blowingly, insanely abusive shit and piss all over everybody who's associated with it. And you really don't have a lot of choices of anywhere else to go if you want to keep doing that one thing. Like, there's a lot of people who are stuck with YouTube, even though YouTube right now, anybody can make a claim on your video and get your videos taken down without any evidence whatsoever. They can make claims on your videos. I showed, I think, a tweet or something a while back of just like chicken scratch, just child gibberish. Just like, I didn't like this video.
Mm-hmm.
And multiple videos got taken down for that, because there is no actual user intervention on behalf of Google or anyone else, even remotely involved, on YouTube.
Yeah,
Nobody
it's all
gives a fuck.
automated stuff. I mean, there's with the amount of videos on YouTube, they need some sort of automated answer, but they also need.
This is like legal stuff, though. This is
Yeah.
stuff that if it's fraudulent, and if you know your shit, you can take these people to court and you can fucking destroy them for shit like this.
Yeah.
But YouTube would rather just bend over and say, hey, you just take it down, than ever risk having to come to something like court, because of how expensive court is.
No, they would settle out of court every time because they want to
Yeah.
avoid any damage to their brand that isn't already. Well, that is avoidable, I guess, because everybody's already fucking jumping ship with Google and Facebook and all these other things.
But the problem is that there really isn't a suitable alternative for YouTube right now. A lot of the other streaming sites are really behind in many ways. Like, their infrastructure and technology, for some reason, hasn't really moved since when they moved out. Like, Nico Nico is probably the biggest one that I know of, but apparently Nico Nico just really isn't that good for foreigners. And
Listen, Nico Nico, Billy Billy, you guys want to come up with some different fucking names? What are you trying to turn me gay? What the fuck is Billy Billy Nico Nico? Dude, come on, man. Or come on, men, I should say. What I really want to know is, how long is this, there's like these tech companies that have an insane amount of presence to the point where they basically have a bunch of monopolies where, you got Twitter, you got YouTube, And there are some things about the other areas, like obviously you mentioned Nico, you mentioned Bilibili, but there are like other platforms out there potentially for like stuff like video content, YouTube alternatives. But when there was that supposed Patreon alternative, Subscribe Star, because that's gay, they had a big scam where PayPal just blocked transfers from Subscribestar, and then Stripe did it too. And this is a while back, so this is like kind of old news now. But they managed to get restore the service, but it came at a cost of an insane amount of reputation damage for people like PayPal and people like Patreon, because like a bunch of people are leaving Patreon because of their shitty uh, design or shitty business ethics, and they go to this alternative. And then what happens in response is PayPal, somebody who's a business partner of Patreon, shuts down their competitor and makes it so that they can't even compete in the space. And like shit like that happens. Meanwhile, you still have these people saying, "Oh, you don't like it? Go make your own platform." And look what happens when you do. And of course, the reason why they were shut down was like some insane shit, like, "Oh yeah, they're all right wing people." Yeah, Jordan B. Peterson, notorious fucking Hitlerite. Get him out of here. It's just insane. Like, I don't understand how these people exist in the same world that we do. But so you have these weird tech monopolies. The same thing is true of stuff like Steam. Steam is an insane monopoly compared to other stuff, but it also doesn't have any competition. It keeps coming back to this whole idea where we were talking about these games that don't have any competition, like StarCraft 2. Well, these platforms don't have any competition. Yeah, they just people have all of these games on Steam. They look up how expensive my Steam profile is, how valuable. There's websites to track how much money your Steam account is worth for some fucking reason. Like, I don't understand why anybody would give a shit about that unless they were eBaying it. And yet you have all this stuff, and at some point, man, you gotta wonder what.
Well, technology is very young.
Yeah, but
like digital technology is super young, and that means you get into a lot of instances where stuff's locked in, like Steam. Why does Steam lock you in? Because it's the central traffic. So you have a lot of developers now that are like, we don't want to pay Valve our funds anymore, the 30% cut or whatever. So we're gonna make our own launcher.
yeah,
And maybe they get back, the 30% by extent of that, but they lose all of the traffic.
yeah.
And none of those launchers have good connotations associated with them.
Oh yeah.
Blizzard's launchers is terrible. Ubisoft's launcher is terrible. EA's launcher is terrible. They're all fucking bad. Most people won't use those launchers just because they're not Steam. Not because Steam is good, but because all these developers have such bad reputations with their launchers, they won't use them. So the 30% they got back, they lose that and probably more.
Oh yeah, for sure. It doesn't end up being profitable. I mean, that's why Steam has been allowed to stay as dominant as it is in the market, because people have tried these alternatives and failed every single time. And yeah, because they got the lion's share. It's just like World of Warcraft. Like they were obviously like Titan Quest came before it or whatever, or EverQuest rather came before it. But World of Warcraft got the lion's share of people interested in MMO. Yeah.
And locked them in by extent of being in the first position, because everything
that's how PUBG
so young
got
and
it.
so volatile that once you figure out that one formula, you're basically just sat so long as you can keep it stable. And the thing with Steam is there's no way for it to not be stable. Like, Valve has basically just said, we don't care what the fuck you put on our service, so long as it's not like blatantly illegal or trolling or whatever. So now, you got a lot of the smaller Asian studios are like, hey, we can put H games on here. We can access an audience we never fucking had, because most of our H games were on obscure Asian websites that most foreigners aren't even going to try to use, except for the hardcore weebs who own like 30 genuine katanas and have a neckbeard that could drown Hitler in them. Those are the only people who are going to use it. But now we can put it on Steam. And Steam, that's the whole fucking planet as far as their marketing audience is concerned. It's everybody. Like, people think of digital distribution, it's Steam. Steam's it. That's it. That's where your games are. That's where you go. Because nothing else comes to mind, because Steam was the first. And Steam was just about Valve's games. And then on came the other stuff, and there really wasn't another. I mean, there's probably other platforms like that, like maybe like GameSpy or whatever, but none of them had the prominence that Valve did at the time, because Valve had that huge fucking brand name from Half-Life and Counter-Strike and stuff like that. And they had all that traffic surrounding it, which means they had the huge amount of exposure. All these people said, hey, we can buy other games on here. Look at me, you can buy all this other stuff. It's already on Steam. It's already on this thing we have installed because we play Counter-Strike. We play those those knife matches on those porn maps, and we put goat sea sprays and stuff. Now we can buy games on here too.
Can't do that in CS:GO anymore.
And yeah, so they were the first. So in order to compete with that platform at that time, you had to been like, okay, so we need as much traffic as what Valve makes with their games on their service. And at that point, I think the only one who could have done that would have been like Caspa. Like not Blizzard with StarCraft, but Caspa with StarCraft. Like you needed that massive central establishment, and nobody had that, so nobody was going to compete. So you get that snowball effect. It just keeps rolling. It just keeps getting bigger. And at that point, like rather than compete, you integrate because it's not safe to compete, and you have a very very low chance of success, even if you want to risk it. And that's why you end up with the situations where like let's make mobile games instead of PC games. Let's make easy games and cutesy games instead of difficult games and grueling games or whatever. Like it's just not safe to do that because while an audience may exist, it's not as big and not nearly as reliable. So it's always about that reliability because games are not about making games except to the very very few people. And as I've always said, it's always obvious when you're going through some of these games like World of Warcraft or Warcraft 3, you can always find evidence that some people sometimes in the company gave a shit, but it was never the company at a large because the company at a large isn't making a game. It's making that product. And people don't care about the game, they care about the identity of it. And you get down that wacky wild road, which is the way the market has been shaped. The SJW stuff and PayPal and stuff like that you brought up is a great example of that because it's all about silencing and alienating the competition rather than actually doing anything about it. So
Well, yeah,
you
they don't
have
even want to risk engaging with them in the marketplace of ideas or whatever, or just the actual
yeah,
marketplace and saying like, hey, here's a market. We got product A, we got versus product B. You pick. If we can stop product B from ever getting to the shelf, then we can just claim that there is no, it's not a monopoly because nobody else exists, or we technically have these ones who have already agreed to sort of kiss the ring in this case, and I assume that's what happens with like Stripe and these Square and these other companies that are out there in that financial transaction processor, payment processor sort of
or
space.
it's like why compete when we could just do the same fucking thing instead? Like that's the World of Warcraft fallacy. How many fucking games have come out that claim to be World of Warcraft killers that were carbon copies of World of Warcraft? Just too fucking
Well,
many.
that's the thing is if you deviate too much from what is already profitable, you have no guarantee and thus no business plan to sell your investor that you are going to be profitable, and so you can't actually make that fucking game. Even in the rare case that does happen, very rarely is it actually seen as a trend setter or of unto itself, and very rarely is it any successful. Meanwhile, if you just want a carbon copy cargo cult and carbon copy these different games, then you're not really going to get anywhere. Really, it's just more of the same. So you just get into this issue where you have this false dichotomy, these two options, when really, presumably, anyways, the answer actually lies somewhere in between. If you wanted to make a financially viable but also high quality product, but honestly, at this point, I'm so jaded from all of my experience in the industry that I'm more likely to believe that those two things are mutually exclusive at this point. That you can't be a financially viable and highly profitable project without also being low quality or having some things
I
that are
haven't seen it
definitively,
anyways.
having some things that are definitively like against the ability your ability as a product to compete in a qualitative sense. You might be able to
Like
compete profitability wise, but you won't be able to compete in a qualitative sense with these other titles that are not about profitability and are more about quality.
you have to ask what is profitable to these people because most people are like, we want to go big. We want to be the biggest. So they've got to go for the scummiest shit. They've got to go for the biggest shit. Very, very few people are willing to settle for being niche. So they're not willing to take any risks associated with being niche. If you really want to get into niche stuff, you got to look to like the arcade developers that are still out there in Japan, like Cave, for example, who just keep building for that one audience because it's that one stable niche audience. But the vast majority of developers like, no, we want to be big. We want to be Blizzard, we want to be EA, we want to be on top. So we're gonna make fucking Battle Royale and World of Warcraft and all this other shit, and then act surprised when it doesn't work out.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I just think that it feels so hopeless. At the end of all of these conversations, I always look at it and I think, you got Blizzard laying people off. You got all these companies carbon copying each other, or in some cases, cargo culting each other with the sake of, whatever their products happen to be. You have these platforms that don't even service the constituents properly, the consumers properly. They just sort of do the bare minimum and then keep people locked in so that they don't actually have to innovate and refine their ideas and so on and so forth. Like,
With
where the
Blizzard's
fuck do you
launcher,
go?
I would argue if it even does anything properly to begin with, if it even does what it's supposed to do, it destroys performance and lags a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're trying to emulate a Bitcoin miner, you did a pretty good job.
I just love, because I did a recording I put in the World of Warcraft side B conclusion where I pitted the launching speed of Blizzard's launcher to Unreal 4 opening a multi-gigabyte map with baked lighting in it. Blizzard's launcher was slower by a significant margin. It took Blizzard's launcher significantly longer to switch a tab than it takes Unreal 4 to open a mesh, load all the shaders. Like, it's bad. It's really, really, really bad. Like, something that really just should be instant. You click a button, that's it. Blizzard has somehow managed to turn into something even more computationally expensive than even StarCraft 2's editor.
Yeah, well, didn't you say something to the effect of they have like basically an entire OS operating behind the scenes, or was that Discord?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if they're using fucking Chromium for that entire thing, or Electron, or whatever the hell it's called. That's what fucking Chrome or Discord does.
Yeah, it was Electron.
It has an entire fucking operating system behind it, and it definitely has the RAM imprint.
Yeah. I still can't believe people are using Chrome. Like, what the fuck?
Isn't it possible to launch the Chrome developer or debug menu or something within Discord?
There's like
a specific hotkey for it?
Yeah, there it is. Or it was, anyways.
It was necessary to do that for something. I can't remember what it was. Discord really is like a fantastic example of bloat and over-engineering that people are willing to look past. It's just like, I have to shut this fucking program down anytime I do anything because the CPU competition and the RAM imprint is just so huge. And I use fucking Trillion for years and years and years and years and years and years on AIM. 2 gigabyte transfers, almost never any downtime. This is AIM. This is fucking Yahoo or AOL or whatever. Like, they're not a reputable company. 2 gigabyte transfers, very little downtime. The Trillion client used less than 100 megs of RAM, and you could leave it running for fucking ever. And now we're in 2019. We got Discord that does less than what Trillion did. Can only handle fucking 8 megabytes unless you pay money, for Christ's sake.
Hey, bro, join the hype squad, bro. Hey, you want to join the hype squad?
It's uglier. It's slower. It doesn't do anything with the memory.
Hype squad!
And it uses more memory than half the fucking games I run. It uses more memory than fucking Unreal 4 without any, like, super major stuff open. It uses more memory than 3DS Max. Like, it just fucking boggles the mind that this is acceptable to anyone. And furthermore, that anybody would give them money.
You want to buy Nitro?
Who the fuck would give this company money? And they're still using fucking Speaks. Sorry, Opus. Same fucking thing. They're using the exact same fucking thing that Skype is using, Speaks 2.0, and it still sounds like shit.
It's really funny when there's this podcast that I watch a lot or listen to a lot where they it's like a CSGO podcast, and everybody was giving them shit for using Skype like half a month or half a year ago, and so they were like, all right, fine, we'll switch to Discord because that's what everybody says. And then they switched to Discord, and every 2 hours they have to restart the fucking program because they're using the video service, but it just glitches out every 2 hours. It's so insane. Every single time it happens, they're like, oh yeah, we all love Discord, don't we? We fucking love Discord. Fuck this, fuck. They just go into a tirade about it.
That's why we still use Vent, because Vent is the only fucking service that works. That doesn't sound, I mean, it still doesn't sound amazing, but it sounds a hell of a lot better than all the Speaks and Speaks derivatives.
Yeah, well, Vent should be the basis at this point. That should be like your baseline standard, not fucking 10 light years above it. Above the baseline standard that is Skype and Discord. You know what? That was another thing that you're gonna get a kick out of this. So I was looking up some information on how to use the the various filters and stuff that they had for OBS in terms of audio filters. So there's just two things that I ended up using. One of which is a limiter that stops peaking from happening, and one of which is a noise gate at the beginning that cuts out anything. If I'm just not speaking at all, then it won't broadcast the background of my audio. But the tutorial I found, which of course was on YouTube, talking about audio quality. The tutorial that I found was this guy, and he opens up and he sounds filtered as like it sounds like he's used noise removal way too aggressively on Audition or something. And he's like, "Today I'm going to tell you how to make your audio quality really good in OBS." So it's already a shit fest. But what he was doing is he was running like 3 compressors. Let me see. So he had a noise suppression, which is what was destroying his voice mostly. Then he had a compressor to bump up his volume, but it did so in like the most ass backwards way possible. And obviously, as you know, that's like usually dependent to people's voices. You can't really just one size fits all that, which is what he was arguing. And then there's like after all of that stuff, he also had the limiter, and then he had a like gain. He wanted to like add extra like 10 decibels or something. Like I don't know why he's not just doing that in his compressor. This is just insane. So like this is the kind of shit that is like a recommended tutorial on PS audio. Just an aside, but I thought
you that will like add latency to your resulting file as well. Like I would never run real-time processing in that manner because on CPU side it adds latency, and latency can desync, and there's a reason why a lot of that stuff is available in hardware through XLR sets is to avoid that latency.
Yeah, before it even hits digital, it's already modified.
Because this is so much faster and cleaner. And I mean, I don't stream, so I don't have to worry about any of that shit. Like when I do my recording and like Warcraft 3, I just open up the one channel now and throw on. I actually use 2 compressors. One is the bass. I'm still using the bass Audition compressor because I've done so many different experiments, but that one just seems to work the best. Sometimes I normalize it to 99% if I need to, and I use an Ozone 4 to get rid of the sibilance actually, and then that's pretty much it. I don't even use like noise reduction or anything like that. Like I don't even need to do that. And I mean, for Fraps, it's pretty much the same way too. Even with a merged stream, it's just a little different compressor that I used. And audio is actually really, really easy to do, but so many people just overthink it. They really just overwork it.
Yeah.
And OBS is really bad enabler for that.
Well, on top of it, it's like people are worried about software side fixes to stuff that really is just an environmental issue. Like your setup has to be better than.
Like there's a reason why I never need to run noise reductions because my environment is clean.
Yeah. And so you get that, but you also have it's the same sort of thing. Back when I was doing voice acting or voice editing videos, I would like tutorials on how to make a Protoss voice or whatever when I was like 12 years old because I thought I knew what I was doing. The constant thing that I would hear from people is that, oh, my voice sounds pretty bad, so I want to add effects to it to make that sound better. It's like effects don't make acting. It's sort of the same issue. Is like you guys are talking about stuff that's a problem before you even push the recording button. You have some issues that you got to resolve.
Yeah. So, for example, if you listen to my recordings from 2000, let's see, I think, which was the last 2014 recording before we moved. I guess it would have been last. No, it was Last of Us in 2014. I can't remember. But anyways, all those old recordings with the Yeti. So the Yeti is really, really bad for picking up background voice, especially reverb. And at the old place, I sat next to a closet, and I had a bathroom behind me. So the closet, of course, the doors are like laminated or coated or whatever in paint, and that's reflective. Like reverb wise, it will reflect a lot of audio. So that's deflecting a lot of audio. And then, of course, the bathroom behind me also chews out audio. So that results in all this fucking reverb, and the compressor picks that up. So the compressor will boot. Like if you can't really hear it too well, like I'm trained to the point where I can hear it even with these headphones on. I've got new fucking pads on them. that really cancel audio, and I can still hear it in my voice right now, even though it's not that pronounced because I've just been trained to hear it. But the compressor will boost it so everybody fucking hears it. Like on your voice, I can hear it, and it's coming off of the walls, it's coming off the ceiling, it's coming off the floor, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So when we were moving, I did a lot of reading about noise cancellation because it was not something I'd ever thought of before because I never did like I did voice acting, but I never like thought, oh, I'm doing video casting and removing, and my environment's going to change. Something's going to be a problem. We have to think about, how much noise I'm producing and how much noise other people are producing because I don't know what environment I'm going to be in. It's the first time I really took it seriously. And I was thrown into this fucking world where people are like, oh, you need to spend $900 on a piece of foam and to plate your whole fucking room in foam to cancel noise. And I'm like, no, you fucking don't. This is not what all these other fucking people in their closets are doing. And they're people like, oh, you just put egg cartons on your wall. And I'm like, you don't need to fucking do that either. There's going to be more tricks to it than that. And it turns out there is.
I just wrap myself in my microphone in a blanket and use my phone to read the script.
No. Yeah, you can do that. You can do that too. What I ended up doing for Retribution.
Oh. Hello?
1 second. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
My grandmother was just we are so fucking like in the shitter right now that in order to make coffee, I have to use the little coffee packets I have for my coffee machine. So she just woke up at fucking 1 a.m. and is like, I want to make coffee, and I'm like, okay, give me a minute. So,
well, you can wrap this up if you have to go.
yeah, I'll have to go in a minute. I'll only be gone for a minute, but like I was saying, noise cancellation. So for Retribution, I use a reverb shield. So a reverb shield is, I think I spent about $50 on it or so. It's actually valued about $300 to sell right now. The price has gone up that much. And this is with the Yeti, and I produced like $20,000 studio quality sound easily just by having the microphone inside the Yeti. But also this room that I'm in, it's got like office styled roof with like pocketed foam-ish, not really foam, but I don't really know what they are, but they're not wood. Panels in the ceiling, and most importantly, it's like cloth curtains behind me. So the biggest reverb is coming from a closet that's to the far back left, and I've broken up in front of me with the multiple monitors and stuff behind the monitors. So if you can't like afford to treat your walls, which you guarantee you can't, because treated fucking foam is a fucking scam, you just break up the sounds and put angular objects to push sound waves away from you. And so if you listen to those old recordings from before I moved to immediately after I moved, I think immediately after I moved may have been Rondo or Symphony of the Night or something like that from Last of Us, where like the audio quality completely fucking changes. It's all due to the environment. And then Retribution, it doesn't even sound like it's the same person or microphone. Like it just is a world apart because of that isolation shield, which is too big to use in general recording. So right now, although you won't be able to hear it right now because Discord is no doubt destroying it, I am using like a $150 something XLR microphone, the Rode M2, and I'm using a $150 front end, the Scarlett Solo, and that did have a significant quality jump as well. And before that, I was actually using the AT2020, which was also remarkably different than the Yeti because of the way it handled sound. It was more of an isolated sound, even though it was still a condenser. And like all these microphones are very, very different. So like just general casting, when you're dealing with compressors and you're trying to deal with a mixed source, you tend to use a more aggressive compressor than you're going to use in voice acting where it's a more controlled source. And that background audio is going to get fucking destroyed. And most people whose videos I've watched on YouTube as tutorials for something like 3ds Max or FFX or whatever, it actually sounds like they're just recording inside of a jet engine. Like they pried a microphone out of their laptop and they're sitting inside a fucking washing machine or a jet engine or something while it's running. And that's their recording environment because you get this horrible buzzing, sound gets locked into one channel, like just shit that just should have never fucking happened to begin with. And here we are like trying to get like 24-bit instead of 16-bit out of OBS and all this other shit, and we're wondering, why the fuck are people on YouTube still recording instead of jet engine? There's no standards for any of these people at all.
Why have standards when you can make Warcraft 3 Oh, wait.
All right, I'll be RB. I just gotta get this coffee. before she starts throwing cats at me.
Oh, shit. Well, now it's just me in the chat. So what are you guys up to? I saw Luciferius just talking about how his, he was going to drive into a pond or something. And we got Balathal hanging. We got Razorback 9999 Abel, who's he's out. See ya. Coffee, that's Canadian for cocaine. I'll ask him about that, but I'm pretty sure he's... I think he can barely afford the coffee, dude. Where do you get your third-party C++ Discord client? That sounds like it would be useful as long as it still has all of the features of Discord normally. Really, I think it's strange that we have such an insane industry that we are that we are a part of, man. As consumers or observers or whatever you want to call us. It's just so weird that we exist in this twilight zone. What'd you say?
We live in a society.
We do live in a society. Dude, what has Medicare been up to, man?
I have no idea. I don't follow anyone. I just get linked stuff and that's it.
Medicare has been a real man. He's been like talking about a furry that got shot by a Mexican outside of a Jewish Zionist meeting or something. We do live in a society.
We live in a society.
So, are there any last topics you'd like to cover in this 24th episode, halfway to 42 of the Big Boys Table?
Nothing I can think of unless you wanted to ask me anything.
Oh yeah, I'll get to that in a second. That'll be like our Q&A section at the end. I think the only thing that I wanted to talk about before we move away from the more topical, like news-related elements, is that it's very simple and very satisfying. Actually, as a ship poster, I can definitely relate to this. To just look at these people who are like crying as a result of losing their jobs at Blizzard and saying, "Don't you guys have jobs?" But you kind of need to, like, it's not... I think this podcast has been illuminating insofar as we've discussed that even the developers at these companies are beholden to some real insane shit, like these investors that are just going to sue them or sue their parent company, which may lead to them losing their job for completely unrelated reasons because they were just following the directives of their marketers or their, whatever was, their team leads were telling them stuff, and they were taking cues from marketers, and the marketers are taking cues from the investors, and it's just this insane daisy chain that doesn't even have anything to do with making a game.
Yeah, I have no sympathy towards them, but I don't envy their position one bit.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those weird situations where I've seen a lot of people who are just like laughing at them, and I'll laugh too, so I'm laughing sort of with them, but I also can see the other side of it, It's not as one-sided affair as I thought. When you see like Blizzard's name being dragged through the mud by all of these development or all of these news agencies, and like it's like a bit of poetic justice. It's like, oh yeah, that fucking company that's a sham. Love those guys. Fuck those idiots or losers or whatever it was. But it's all what they get for making Tracer gay, is what my chat says. So yeah, never mind. Fuck them.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was some kind of ploy to just gay wash their company. All the people that got fired were cis, white.
There is a guy on Twitter who tweets some of the most insane, like Alex Jonesian shit. His name is like James, his profile is like something James A. Rayner, I think. And the picture is like Joe Rogan photoshopped onto Mike Morhame's head or something. This is a really insane guy, but he's a man, and he talks about like, he's like, Blizzard is Blizzard is run by lesbians. Dude, I love that guy. Oh man, so I just think it's we have some very strange people in this industry, this society that we live in. and some of them just got fired. And
Some of them have magic tricks to show up.
yeah, some of them are researching magic tricks as we speak by storing them alongside company secrets on a fucking flash drive in 2019.
I so can't believe that's a fucking. Oh man, this is a weird.
When
fucking
I was
reality.
15, I paid a homeless man to buy me porn. So now I want to know how my 15-year-old son is getting his porn. Reasonable.
Well, Dad's gonna be homeless soon.
Yeah, I guess it'll all come full circle. So that concludes the news cycle. Anyways, it was a lovely chat. Is there? So you were talking earlier about Apex, not Legends. Your that's unfortunate, isn't it? Your StarCraft 2 campaign.
It's equally unfortunate in many ways.
Yeah.
StarCraft 2.
Yeah, it is. So aside from being linked to Battle Royale, will there be a Battle Royale map in your? No, is there?
Well, they'll be free for all maps. So
Yeah, there you go.
You
It's sort of
could
the same thing.
kind of construe those as battle royale.
I think that not enough RTS content out there. I mean, for one, none of it really exists, anyways. Not certainly not in the mainstream, but not enough RTS content has those those free, like almost open-ended maps where. Like I was setting up a map on a stream a while ago, and one of the things that I was commenting on was the fact that like theoretically, you know, the way that the map could play out is that you have, you know, two different or you have like many different paths that the player could take, and they could, you know, one player could get destroyed by two AI just based on the luck of the draw, based on what the player did earlier, like they weaken them and then they get annihilated by the later attacks that come to them, and so like the whole thing could morph entirely differently depending on, you know, one small thing in the early game could lead to a completely different end game, and that to me is like super attractive when it comes to a level design like ethic. So what is your, I guess, thought process when it comes to like setting that stuff up? Do you go with this segmented approach where the early stage is kind of scripted out, where you have these attacks that like, oh, okay, first player one attacks player two, and then player one will attack player three, and then so on and so forth? Or is it always like a random chance? Or how do you structure like the early game with not full knowledge that it could drastically affect the late game and the mid game and stuff like that?
Well, ideally, I have a way to randomize their targets, so it's never hard
Right.
set early on.
Okay.
But it's kind of difficult. Like I don't know if I don't think we don't have that right now. I don't believe, but it definitely would change depending on what the player does, because I don't know what it does right now, but just like chooses a target based on a seed. Because if it's a seed, then I might be able to randomize that. But
I'm surprised you don't have something in like weird. We just have a random chance out of 255 to jump to a different block, so we just use that in Brood War.
Well, I could hypothetically do that too.
Oh, okay.
But to actually choose which player they attack in the melee script, I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at it for a very long time. It's been like 2 years since I've really looked at it. I haven't looked at the AI in my current development since then. But in the ideal circumstances, they would just be random. They would just choose their targets at random, unless they had a character predisposition to go for somewhere. But
Like
as it is right
personality.
now, what tends to happen is fairly static, which isn't really that good. I think it's a seed or something. I mean, hypothetically, if they take the triggers for their target, I can randomize that. I could jumble it up in the beginning and then it'll play out differently. But due to the terrain, like usually when I design it, I think about I have an idea in my head of like a general idea of what the gameplay is going to be. So the classic I've commonly returned to in the demonstrations for performance and otherwise is the 0x01, that free for all map, in which the player is actually in the middle of the map and they're in low terrain, and there's a water cliff in front of them, so they can be attacked by air units from there. There's high ground surrounding all of them, with two cliffs, one of which is blocked off by destructible cocks. And destructible cocks and other structures like that don't take bonus damage from armor 2 versus armored anymore. So they're actually quite time consuming to destroy. So you don't usually take those out in the early game. You've usually got to deal with your opponent That's within pissing distance of you early on. But what happens from there tends to vary depending on where the project was, or sometimes the Dynex would attack you if Ricky did not destroy the Cox and attack you first. A lot of the times in my tests, you actually get hit by 3 players at the same time. So they're fighting each other while they're attacking you, which was always a very interesting experience to happen all at once. Because usually there's sort of a little bit of a lull between early game and then that, because they were building up to mid and late game tech, and the tech was sort of slower. So that was sort of a kind of a preferred approach, and they had the faster early game. So usually when I think of the maps, I think of pacing. So in the free-for-all map, I wanted it to be fairly, like in the initial concept, that's map that had the bunker rush. So all the other players were active while you were getting bunker rushed. So if you managed to draw out your defense and subsequent retaliation against the opponent who was bunker rushing you, and it lasted like 15-20 minutes, you were going to be facing opponents on the elsewhere on the map who have actually like fully teched up and started expanding by then. So there was like a sort of like it's called like a soft enrage, where the other map has actually become very, very difficult as a result of you taking so long. Rather than something being hard set in the triggers, it was ultimately determined by how those other players were actually interacting with each other and you at the same time. So when I was thinking of that, I was thinking, okay, well, in normal Blizzard circumstances, what you would actually do is segregate the map completely that says this portion of the map only actually activates after you've done the first portion, so that you don't have an incident where, okay, this other player's had 20 minutes to build up, and now he's going to suddenly appear inside your base with battlecruisers while you're still struggling to finish off this one guy. But that's actually a part of the free-for-all experience. Like, that's the entire reason why you play free-for-all, is for the very, very strange matchup situations where you end up in circumstances like that. So to segregate the map in such a way would actually defeat the entire thing. So in that map, it was always insinuated the AI actually just would not get any free money until at a point, because the AI is notoriously terrible at handling resources. And especially when you're doing things by bullies, which is at the time what the map was actually constructed with. But just in general, the AI is not very good at resources. So I was just going to say, well, the AI's resource multiplier it gets wouldn't actually activate for a few minutes. So their attack was going to be a little bit slower than yours, but it still was going to be largely dictated by actually teching up and building their units. So that's how it was going to be balanced. So I built that map with the entire intent that you had to play the early game well. You had to survive. And in knowing that it was a free-for-all and there was other opponents, it was up to the player to decide if they wanted to try to defend against a potential aggressor from another portion of the map or try to finish off their opponent. That was the entire goal. So I was definitely aiming for that very volatile nature. When designing stuff like that, it really comes down to the pacing, though. So with the opponents, I normally had them wait until they had larger unit counts. Due to the way that the melee AI in StarCraft 2 is designed, you can't actually design attack waves around specific unit types. The only thing unit types do is tell the AI whether or not they're actually added to an attack wave or not. So you could trigger it otherwise, but then it becomes much more static. Within this, it's more fluid, but it's a little less possible to control. So you would say, I have 50 units, now I'm going to attack. So that's the kind of control that we have with the current AI setup. So the AI wouldn't actually really start building military units until it had a large infrastructure ready to go. It would otherwise be fairly defensive. So that meant that once they actually started attacking, it was going to become kind of relentless. Like it's definitely a level of aggression you can't get in Brood War, because Brood War tends to really stagger out how it builds units. This is very much a state that once they actually reach that production, it just kind of doesn't stop. So
yeah, I mean the way you would do that or simulate that anyways in Brood War is you would have every single you'd probably have something like a guard request from every block of production and every set of
guard shit.
Yeah, so and that way the guard you can set it guards to be permanent as long as they come from a specific town. And so every bit of production would probably be its own town or something like that. So it would be feasible, but it would definitely be more
this is much more on lines of like how an actual player would behave.
Yeah. It'd be a bit, like, it would definitely be a bit more abstract.
You notice in a high level match, as long as they have supply of money, their barracks and stuff are always flashing. Like there's always stuff being built. That's pretty much how this. So what this means is that when the AI actually reaches that point in their production where they have the buildings and the supply to build what they need, and the map actually like reaches action points, it just doesn't really stop. Like it's just the AI building huge fucking armies and throwing them at you incessantly.
Yeah.
So what that means is that because of the way that is, that you can make the AI super unfair by giving them a really, really low attack wave merge count. And they will just basically, like, as they build up, they will just keep spamming units at you, which in the free-for-all situation, it certainly would make the map more difficult for the player, but I wanted to give players the chance to actually build up in this map, because that's normally what FFAs have, is that little bit of build-up and expanding and stuff like that.
Well, you also get to scout around, right? And maybe predict,
Yeah.
especially if you're talking about the attacks being randomized. Like, my fear with that when it comes to Brood War maps is that you might get double teamed or triple teamed or something like what you were describing earlier. And in Brood War, we have not yet resolved the issue where AI ignore units that don't attack their attack waves until they reach their destination. And so AI will potentially cross paths with other AI that they're hostile to, but they won't actually attack that yet. So we're still working on a resolution of that, and I'm not sure when that will be resolved. So, but even assuming that was resolved in the foreseeable future, because hypothetically it's not actually that difficult to do, even with that being said, multiple attacks coming to your doorstep and that being random would feel a little unfair to me because it's sort of like the luck of the draw. But at the very least, you can sort of scout around and maybe have some counterplay. You figure out what's happening. You know that there's going to be an element of randomness. You have to scout around to see what your enemies are doing.
I try to design the terrain for that.
Right, yeah. So there would be some inclusion of that. Well, you were talking about terrain based like visual storytelling as well, with the environment sort of showing you some of the tools that the enemies would be using and like giving you some sort of insight to that before. And with my dead unit suite that I've been working on, I can sort of do a similar thing. And so I could see a lot of parallels in that respect. But yeah, I mean, as long as like scouting is still viable, which you've talked a great deal about, making the early game another thing and having it so that you can actually build up in the early stages when AI start out with basically the same thing that you do, just your command center and your workers or whatever. Then I could definitely see a world where that sort of gameplay would still be persistent and you'd still have some tools to answer the aggression that you're talking about before it actually begins, before it manifests. So what would your plan be for when the AI actually enter into those action points? What would the players' responses end up being? Would they just have to utterly destroy the enemy, or would they be able to harass the economy and stuff like that?
Well, the economy, since StarCraft 2 has a built-in function to give a multiplier based on their income, the economy will always be a good point to attack because the AI is always going to be innately less efficient than the player is with their units. You're always going to be able to get more power budget out of your units than the AI. You're always going to be able to take units off the AI that human would not be able normally to get you. So even though they're getting free money, that free money is directly based on their income. It's a multiplier of their current income that they get off of turning in resources and gas. So if you keep killing their workers, they're going to run out of money just like a player does. So I believe by default in StarCraft 2 that multiplier is either 2 times or 3 times. In this project, I was probably going to make it 1.5 times or something around there. Like, not quite as much, but enough that their shitty worker counts weren't going to really inhibit them too much. It was something that was going to need to be tested, or it's going to be map specific anyways.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's sort of the same thing. I've sort of same conclusion I've reached in Brood War is that sometimes it might have to be map specific or player specific, where you have a situation where like some AI might need gas more often or more in greater numbers, so maybe the gas multiplier is different than the mineral multiplier or something like that. But that does seem to be way more organic than just giving them 10k or whatever resources at the start and then hoping for the best.
Yeah, some of the races were going to function really differently. Like if we were saying the project reaching into later stages, where you start seeing the new race that was going to change the Zerg, controlling them was actually going to be about stopping them from building structures. So they were just going to basically build across the entire map. I wasn't entirely sure how I was actually going to technically implement it, but the literal sense was that their buildings would spawn more buildings, and those buildings would spawn more buildings, and they just keep growing across the map. It gets to the point where you just don't have buildable space anymore. So you really have to try to actually control the map. Controlling the map is really the main thing I try to aim for in both the map design. I was talking about how I was dealing with unusual expansion designs and having high value positions that were exceedingly vulnerable with like very large amounts of resources that you could mine from a distance or something like that. Controlling those regions in particular, not allowing the AI to hold them and build defenses there, and otherwise holding those regions, like it was going to be something where I was hoping I could avoid too many instances where the player could just march across the map with only the one army and completely take out everything by enabling the AI to have enough production to at least compete with you along the way. And defensive structures also, there's being many tiers of defensive structures and different kinds of defensive structures, at least offering some kind of counterplay available defensively. So I was hoping to have something where we could have a prolonged team gay or FFA style game in which the match played out in phases, with the player taking expansions and holding the expansions, and then that terrain feeling valuable, either from an offensive or a defensive standpoint, based on the fact that holding resources was important. It was definitely going to be designed in the manner in which the player never wanted to be floating resources, no matter what they were doing. There was always going to be more build space. There was always going to be more structures or higher tech units or something they really wanted to obtain. I never wanted there to be a stage where you felt like you had already done everything, but there was still a half hour of gameplay on the map to go. So that's why we started implementing stuff like larger tech trees, the artillery system, and the SDI systems and stuff like that. Although I don't know if those will actually be implemented into the Apex J version of the project. It ultimately depends if I can make the AI behave with them or not. The artillery was very based on Supreme Commander with blind fire and stuff like that. And there was SDI systems that could shoot down the artillery shots. I believe all those were at one point functional. I don't know about now. But getting the AI to use the blind fire was something I don't know would be feasible, because the only way I know personally how to do it is to have the AI scan for viable targets. But the highest tier artillery can actually target like a quarter of a 256 by 256 map or more. It's just ridiculously inaccurate. So you'd have to have the AI scan that distance as well to choose a target, which would be very expensive to do through Galaxy. And there's no other way to do it as far as I know. So unless the AI can blind fire the artillery very well, there's no point in having something in the game the AI can't use.
Yeah.
So that's like distant future kind of stuff that I can't even begin to access right now. But um, ideally, we would have situations where the AI would uh, at times be inclined more or less to turtle and rely on ballistic and strategic level options from within their base. Weapons that can be counterplayed in their own manner, like SDI systems for artillery and ballistic missiles and stuff like that, while more or less building very expensive stuff that can change the pacing of the game depending on what the player owns and what the AI owns. And at certain times in the map, like we'll probably have time-based switches that says, hey, an hour of the gameplay has passed. The AI probably shouldn't build up to 20 units and then attack with that. We should probably be looking at basically waiting until we're at full food to bother attacking. So and just making maybe conditional based stuff per map. This is hey, the AI doesn't hold this particular location anymore. We probably don't have access to this extra build space. We should probably adjust our conditions for attacking appropriately and stuff like that. So while in general, when I look at the maps, to me they're just glorified melee maps in which I give the AI a few little pointers about when to do here or there, and more or less it's just going to build stuff based on its build order and hopefully play reasonably well like a melee AI would. It really does come down to the terrain. So scouting is definitely about figuring out what paths you should pay attention to. So there's a lot of variable large paths, choke points, a lot of ramps and stuff like that. Because StarCraft 2 doesn't have cliff advantage like StarCraft 1 does, I try to really push build space a lot. So there's a lot of structures you can build that are very big and very valuable, like mass fabricators that will actually generate minerals for you. And just like the ones in Supreme Commander, they also explode very violently when they're destroyed. So build space tends to be something you tend to be concerned about as time goes on, because you want to have access to these structures, especially if you're stuck in a defensive position, which in many cases you're probably going to be, especially when you're just learning how to play. So you're going to want to actually, a lot of these maps are designed in a way where it's actually beneficial to expand outwards and take more terrain early on and try to hold that terrain than to hold out in one spot, because of the long distance units that tend to be in the game. can make holding out in a very small spot very, very difficult. And then you won't have access to the build space you want to reach the macro capacity you need, even if you have the resource income to sustain it. So I think a lot about how the player is going to be trying to abuse the AI, because that's going to happen. That's always going to happen. No matter how much time I put into the AI or what I conditionalize or how I design the maps, the player is going to abuse the AI. So I accept that from the very beginning, and I say, okay, the player is going to abuse the AI. How can I design this map in a way in which the player can play to their strengths and the strengths of the very powerful units and structures I give them, but also give the AI ways to fight back as well. Also give the AI ways to fight back against certain abuse. So there's the Battlecruiser replacement in the Corvette. It has 20 range railguns that will basically instantly destroy most low-level ground units, but it overkills a lot. But it's long range. So I think about how the AI can counterplay against the very obvious situation where the player is probably going to just acquire a large number of these and try to kite the AI around. I always make sure the AI composition at that point has something that can actually fight these units accordingly. Because even if they're balanced units, a lot like regular battlecruisers or carriers in StarCraft 1, there's going to be situations where the AI is just not going to fight them optimally whatsoever. And the Zerg, for example, I gave them access to Scourge, and I gave them access to Leviathans and stuff like that, which were primary targets the player wants to build and abuse. So you have a reason to try to abuse it. So then I factor that into the difficulty where I say, okay, not only can you try to abuse the AI, you actually have to abuse the AI to survive. So you have to make use of the skill set to survive. So then I turn something that has an inherently negative connotation, which is cheapening and making the game easier by abusing weaknesses in AI, into something you are encouraged to do just to survive. It's now a part of the difficulty scaling. You have to make use of the behaviors of the units to their absolute fullest advantage to survive. You have to take every single advantage you can get where you can get it to survive. So in the Zerg map that I've shown in many demonstrations, that's the map with the Leviathans in it. The only way that I was able to actually survive against the Leviathans in that map, which was by using my Corvettes to drag the Leviathans into my AI allies' defenses. And my AI ally would take huge damage, but we would both survive by extent of me doing that. If I didn't do that, the Leviathans and their air fleet would basically destroy everything. So, because there was just so many Zerg in your base at that point that if you didn't kill the Leviathans and they were allowed to sit there and absorb a lot of damage for the other Zerg, they would pretty much just kill you instantly. So you had to exploit your long-range units that were long-range enough to survive engaging the Zerg and then pull them away to survive. And that to me was a very positive experience. You turn something that's inherently negative, which is just cutting stuff around. That's something everybody does in all of these games. You know, StarCraft 2, Vikings can kite battlecruisers. That's something everybody has always done since the game came out, is trivialize battlecruisers by using Vikings to outrange them and kite them. If you have the AI in such a position where you need to exploit this behavior to actually defeat them, you turn something that someone's going to do anyways into something that they're encouraged to perform better in to survive. That's the kind of behavior I want. That's the kind of interaction I want where it says, hey, you have a strength you're going to take advantage of in this game. No matter what I tweak these numbers to, you're going to find ways to exploit these really powerful units. So I want you to do that. I want you to take this stuff and I want you to find ways to exploit it. I want you to find ways to play really well, because you have to do that in order to get past my tutorial map.
Right, so you're basically informing the player in no short order, in no uncertain terms, that they're going to have to learn how to use the units and use them to a reasonable degree of skill in order to just get past the first map, like you were saying. So it's more about I think you're putting a lot more, presumably, at least, a lot more of an emphasis on the tech tree and the changes that you're making therein than the map design itself, where the map design, like you said, it's a melee map. It has these characteristics. The AI can read those as you dictate and make specific changes, but really a lot of the interactions come down to the interactions that are unit-based.
Yep. So, because I don't like script-based maps. I don't like the map being a linear formation of where you go here, this happens, you go there, that happens. That to me is very boring and it eliminates replayability. I've always built all my mods and everything like that based on playing AI versus AI and team games and stuff like that in Melee. Generally speaking, on maps I've built. So I've built those maps over years and years and years and years of AI versus AI, and I've kind of understood the ins and outs of what makes that kind of gameplay interesting. So when we enter the campaign environment, all the campaign environment does is sort of officialize the environment around that engagement and gives it some kind of a story to go with it. It gives you a reason to be invested in what's happening beyond just the gameplay essence. But what I really want to do is just capture that gameplay essence. And since that gameplay essence was largely based on mods and custom AI and stuff like that, we simply focus on what makes it strong. Adding in cutscenes and breaking up the objectives and stuff on the map into arbitrary, like, do this, do that, do this, do that, unless it absolutely positively makes sense in terms of the story where it actually contributes to the AI versus player engagement, there's no reason to have it at all. It can be just resolved in a cinematic between the missions. So all that the writing and stuff like that does is just set us into a stage where we can have a nice fight, and we have a reason to fight. We have some kind of investment. We have something to look forward to when it's actually done, rather than just, it's another map and we get to hear Kerrigan talk about feminism and shit at the end, and then that's it. So when it comes to like the tech tree and the unit behavior, that's what makes the engagement. That's what the player is engaging with. And I'm looking at making the gameplay length longer. Blizzard was looking at making it shorter. Blizzard wanted StarCraft 2 to be resolved in 15, 20 minutes tops. I'm looking at an hour to 2 hours. So that's significantly longer than the average StarCraft 2, even a large map. I'm looking at like the Warlords and Merchants games I played that went up to like 3 hours long, where I was like scraping for survival off of a single command center to come back and win the game. I can't even count how many times I did that. There were too many times. And that was a great experience. Those are really positive, memorable experiences. The reason why I always come back to those is because they were really memorable, positive experiences that spoke about, your ability to survive, your ability to adapt, and the way in which the game played that allowed you to survive like that. So I want to capture that in the single player environment. But I can't do that very easily because that's player versus player. And what I was doing was exploiting people being really, really, careless and ignorant. You can't really do that with an AI. You can't really fake it with an AI. So what you got to do instead is redesign from the ground up how you approach the way progression in the game is made. So the tech trees are not really super complicated. I can tell you there will be no add-ons because they're gay. And StarCraft 2 and add-ons is some voodoo ass shit. Even more so than StarCraft 1. And AI doesn't like them actually. It really doesn't like them at all.
That's
So, but
pretty
this,
insane since you can just make new add-ons and tell the AI to build them, and if they have the requirements to, they can.
yeah, StarCraft 2's add-ons are there's some voodoo ass. So, but there's a lot of things I'm doing to attack. I'm removing upgrades. I'm removing tech researches. I may have tech options such as siege mode is one example, but there's many different types of siege modes in this. Just tied to actually possessing a building. So if the building is active, you can use the technology. If the building isn't active, you can't use the technology. So I've justified all that in the writing, since the buildings are basically like servers, and uh, there's a lot of different fabrication structures of various sizes. There's like 3 or 4 different kinds of starports for your various capital ships and stuff like that. The tech trees in themselves are generally pretty simple. They're not really that complicated. It's like you own this server, now you can build this fabrication facility. You own this fabrication facility, now you can build the support structures for it that unlock the various tech. And I believe for the Gracian tech tree, it was just each server unlocks a new tier of server. But they get progressively more expensive as you go on. I believe that the highest tech structure costed some thousands, like 4 or 5,000 minerals, 4 or 5,000 gas, or something like that, and also a lot of time. So
The
you
servers,
had to
these are things you buy, like you just
you
build
build
like a
them.
normal structure. Okay, because I
Yeah,
when you said that
you build them.
you possess a building or something like that, I thought you meant that you were like capturing it in the middle of a like it was a
No,
pre-play structure or
you build
something.
them.
Okay.
You build them. You build them, and they basically do computations. They're a server. They're like a processing unit that enables the true functions of stuff, because the fabricators and the construction buildings and stuff like that are built to be cheap and effective and deployable. The servers are doing all the computational heavy lifting, so they're all very modular. So that's how we get into like the fabrication system, how we justify it through the writing and how certain behaviors like that interact. It also means that servers are going to be inherently very expensive to make. They're your primary tech trees, they're your spires and your queen's nest and your spawning pools and stuff like that. They're very, very expensive to make, and they also tend to be very large. So I design the terrain in a way in which you want to make use of it for defensive structures or production facilities. We also want to be mindful of where your tech structures are. And I want you to be mindful of the cost and build time of structures even an hour into the game. I want you to be mindful of the fact that you're building this at this point and your enemy could be building that to attack you, and you own this and that expansion. When an hour has passed in the game, normally in StarCraft 2, if you have to replace your tech, it's nothing you really worry about. It's more like a map objective you're worried about. Like if you're stuck on a timer and you take heavy damage, what you lose is progression on the timer. You don't lose anything in relation to your actual position on the map, generally speaking. At least from what I observed of your Legacy of the Void run, that was an absolute fucking painful disaster. Is you really just weren't being engaged from the build and destroy standpoint, except for the one whale map where you had to cross map mine for a while or some stuff like that. Like that's the only time where it was like, oh, you're doing something different on the macro level for once.
Well, that's just
Mostly
because
out
I
of
was
laziness.
lazy.
Yeah, mostly out of laziness. So it's like, but I want you to only be thinking about this most of the time. So
Well, the
I try
enemies
to more
always start
closely
out at the
integrate that.
like. So the same issue that was with that Warcraft 3 campaign that I've been playing, Legends of Arcane, is the same issue that was in Legacy of the Void, where the AI actually start out at the strongest point, and everything at that point is you whittling away at a block of shit. And so, of course, it doesn't make any sense from a narrative standpoint or whatever. You look at that and you're like, wait, this AI has 3,000 food and 10,000 minerals worth of units on the field, and they're losing to me when I started out with nothing. Okay, that makes sense. But then you also have the. I mean, that's just like almost a universal issue, which is really weird because it seems like such a psychotic premise to make your your RTS experience around, but it is almost a universal issue with RTS content, be it custom or official. And so it's definitely nice to know that you're going a different approach where you're actually trying to get people to think about what the enemy could be building at that point, the same way that you would think about a human player in a melee map.
Of course, making the AI place these super expensive tech structures intelligently is another thing that's, unless you do it through bullies, you're probably not going to get them to place them really intelligently. So I'll probably just have them build like multiples or something like that. Like there's definitely going to be concessions, and there's no way of getting around that. But overall, the fact that they're actually building these things all together is still going to be a better experience than normal. And it has been in my tests thus far to this point. But I think that the AI is, well, when you're dealing with something with AI, there's concessions and the fact that you ultimately play the game differently, and the game it's a different game than it would have been in PvP to begin with. It's just going to be a different game, and you just had to accept it's going to be pretty silly. Like the AI is always very silly. It just does strange things. Yes, you can give it tactical AI and all this other shit and try to make it sort of behave like it's aggressive and smart, but it's still something that if you want it to be actually like legitimately difficult, you have to give them some unfair advantages. You have to give them some kind of an edge over the player to compensate for the fact the player is going to be really exploiting the living fuck out of them. And that's definitely like concessions I have to make in this. So
have you considered making like a multiplayer version of this using like Apex is basically a melee mod?
It's not possible. It's not possible.
Oh, okay.
It's too big. It's just too big.
Right, because you would have to use the.
I'm redoing all the voices, all the particles, all the sounds, all the graphics are at least getting tweaked, if not outright redone. There's a lot of Terran factions to do just in the first chapter. That'll definitely be bigger than anything you could upload on Balnet. Like that's too big, and it wouldn't be balanced either. Like it's going to be balanced to the extent that I can balance it, and I definitely hold in regard my ability to balance beyond anything I've ever seen out of StarCraft custom content. But it's not going to be balanced for PvP. So it's definitely going to be balanced in the context of like, this is something I test against the AI. I have a very exhaustive regime in which I test AI versus AI to do balancing as well.
Right.
because it's a very objective way to assess how behaviors interact when you have something that is always the same way, and very structured in how it behaves, to see how they interact with one another. But there's always holes that you will come across in PvP where it just won't be really balanced. Not that I think it would be unenjoyable, but in StarCraft 2's platform, it's not possible to have mods of that level. So it just isn't possible. Otherwise, I would have worked an Armageddon Onslaught instead of a campaign.
Right, yeah, I guess that makes sense.
And it's really stupid, too, because Armageddon Onslaught feasibly is more realistic than a campaign past their performance. StarCraft 2 definitely couldn't run Armageddon Onslaught. But if that wasn't a concern, then the actual implementation of Armageddon Onslaught would be comparatively simple. Because you wouldn't even, unless you were doing AI support for the other races, which you would eventually want to do, but as a baseline, Armageddon in itself doesn't even need that kind of an AI infrastructure. You would just use triggered waves, because that's effectively what it was in StarCraft 1, just with the flimsiness of the melee AI handling it.
Right.
Well, as all the units could just be tactical AI and triggers. So they'd be pretty simple. And the data would be very complicated, but as far as actually implementing the core gameplay mechanics, it'd be easier to implement that. But unfortunately, StarCraft 2 has very, very, very prohibitive size limits, censorship, and other stuff that I most certainly would never want to have anything to do with. Were I actually thinking of making something like that.
Yeah, well, there's also the fact that just the insanity of trying to get a game and play it on that platform.
You'd have to do single player support for sure.
Yeah.
It'd have to be mostly single player project. I don't think you could even get enough people on StarCraft 2's service to fill a 12-player game, especially something with melee gameplay.
No, because people want their RPG maps where they play as Raynor and run around the entire overworld of Zeros or something and chase that infested poontang.
One of the variants of Apex had the Overmind as an anime cat girl, and I think you were playing as Zeratul, and you were caught in that love triangle, and you were chasing the prophet. It was really deranged. But there was the Overmind as an anime cat girl. Kerrigan gets assassinated. Oh yes, Raynor gets Zeratul drunk by just dousing alcohol on him because he's a plant and he just absorbs it through his skin and instantly kills him. God was a goat. There was an intended boss battle against God. He just flew around in the air, rigidly shooting eye lasers at you and berating. I believe that particular concept was actually ported to the CPGA.
I was going to say, it reminds me of Captain Planet.
Yeah. God is always just envisioned as a goat because Goatsy is like God. There are a few more spiritual things in Goatsy. And what do you find within the void except another goat? So that would be God. You find the enlightenment, you find God, you find the goat at the end of the. And God, in all these various iterations, God was never actually really pleased to see you. He'd almost always berate you to some length about how you were a failure, the prophecy was a lie, go back and do something useful with your life, etc. And most of the time, involved him sitting on you, so you were sucked into his asshole next, and then that was your respawn mechanism in the writing. And usually send you on some other deranged path that just wish he just stopped and killed you.
A fate worse than Goatsy.
Needless to say, implementing those into build and destroy missions was very difficult.
Yeah, no kidding. What do you suck up your user interface into the goat hole?
Yeah. Well, those particular things were cinematics, but all the gameplay resolution was still done through build and destroy. A lot of these were just axed because of the unfeasibility of using StarCraft 2's editor base.
Right.
Because making elaborate custom races is definitely not StarCraft 2's strong.
Well, the other issue is even with data or whatever, it's a lot of work. But in something like Brood War, I can spend 10 years smacking my dick against the wall trying to figure out how to make some behavior work in C++. And at least when I'm done, I'm done. But StarCraft 2 can just get an update and break everything.
Yep.
Or delete your mods.
Yeah, like it did to me several times. I have lost months and months.
Yeah.
I really wish that there was some consumer protection laws because I would definitely have evoked my right, because that was a lot of shit that I lost, and that is definitely a concern while working on this project. Is that an update could come along that could fuck everything, but it hasn't fucked up everything yet since Legacy of the Void that I am aware of, except for some things like the Infestor, or not Infestor, the they're
Viper.
called Rectalisks in my mod,
Oh, okay.
and Gurolesks as well. There's all sorts of various hentai references. But I think they were swarm hosts. They don't animate anymore. They just slide around, and that's definitely not a bug that was in my project before. So they've fucked up something.
You remember when I was using Alarak in the micro mission, and I used his wave emoji ability, and it didn't move the borrowed swarm hosts, but they just spun. They made their spinning animation.
Yeah.
It's like, is it like that, but everywhere as soon
Well,
as they move?
it's like their animations are just not assigned to them, and I just don't know how the fuck that happens.
Oh, okay.
Maybe they use an M3A file, but I checked it and everything was hooked up, and so I don't fucking know. All I did was change their fucking names and change their attack names to like Steaming Scatter or something. I also haven't checked to see if my sphincter cannons work or not. They shoot a worm feces projectile, moves very slowly through the air, deals huge splash damage, but you can actually attack it. So there's a lot of like large projectiles like that in the project that you can actually attack. Like Raven Seeker missiles is one of them. And
Didn't you say that the Raven
really
Seeker
encourages you.
missile was like the new Raven attack instead of a special ability? Like it just attacked with them?
Yeah, that's weird. But in this, it's still a spell in this, but you can attack them, and they're like they were before. Like they don't stop in the air or anything like that. Like they just hunt you. So you have to like pay attention to what you're doing and not just like face tank stuff. So there's destructible projectiles and stuff like that I was gonna have to some extent.
What you should do is include a seeker missile that just splits into additional seeker missiles, but it just does that endlessly.
Yeah.
And instead of blowing up, they just eventually crash your game, so you really have to destroy them quickly.
Crowfather actually has that. There is a
Crowfather? What the fuck?
Crowfather. There is an advanced Raven that was for, I believe, the Machine God faction that fires the splitting missile. And I think it makes like a dozen seeker missiles. They can hit structures too in this, by the way, so there is a high chance that like these things would actually just instantly kill small armies if you just allowed them to hit you.
Yeah, if you just A-moved or whatever.
Yeah. So that's like definitely a recurring theme that we're gonna hang on to in this. There's you can build battleships and like battle stations and stuff in this that are very powerful. A lot of their weapons are interacted with in that sort of manner. So it's definitely a theme that we want to hang on to in this, especially if we actually see some progression where we start looking at like adding the Zerg race and stuff like that. Because the Zerg race in this, not related to Zerg at all, thematically similar in some ways, but they are primordial blood from the Apex world, which is significantly more scary than Zerg. And I really want players to feel that fear where even the lowest tier Zerg can end the game. So you want to control them. So to implement stuff like that will be really interesting because I'm pretty sure StarCraft 2 can do it. It's just a matter of figuring out how, because I probably would drive a lot of it through data rather than through the AI. Things like the building spawning and stuff like that, I'll probably have it like an ability, an auto cast ability that like tries to place a structure in some random location or something like that. There's surely ways to do it. I just don't understand because I don't know data editing, but it's just there's lots of ideas that I think would result into really interesting gameplay interaction. Like the Zerg, for example, not just that they built buildings, but I designed a lot of their building concepts in my head with fungus in mind. So you know how fungus, they make shrooms, and then shrooms spread spores. And then, a shroom is just a distribution method for spores and stuff like that. So the way I had it is that the Zerg, they evolved. Larva's not going to exist anymore primarily because they destroy performance. But as the Zerg buildings live, they evolve and they get tougher and they build more things. So it's really all about like trying to keep the map under control and not letting them just keep growing uncontested. So something I definitely wanted to try to like pursue was just they expand everywhere, they take over the map, and you're really encouraged to try to police that as much as you can. Or a lot of these maps that you are finding is usually like a 3-way or 4-way map. So you wanted to try to at least make it somebody else's problem as opposed to yours. So, like, as opposed to, for example, quickly eliminating one opponent, that could put you in a bad spot if you allow the other opponent to get too strong in the meanwhile. So there's lots of little things like that comes just as a result of the fact that you're basing it on a real AI, not like a series of timers. Because, like I said, exploitation. You can always exploit timers, and timers are not dynamic. They're not going to adapt to how fast you do things. They're always just going to be on that timer. A timer is an independent thing, and it's either going to be too much or too little. It's very hard to make a sweet spot. If you make it all based on the AI, based on the same timers that the player is using in terms of their unit construction and building construction, then it flows a lot better.
Well, it definitely sounds like there's a lot more thought put into the tech trees in this than I originally expected. Because I'm coming from like a campaign oriented background where it's not necessarily scripted maps, but it's a lot more about like the maps have some sort of transformative gameplay on the, or they're a bit more morphing, like they morph the gameplay a little bit in different ways than just a melee map would. So it's interesting that you're sort of using the tech trees to accomplish a similar goal, where a lot of the gameplay is morphed around based on what tech is on the field and what tech the AI is using, versus what I would be usually used to doing, which is just making it so that the gameplay has a lot to do with the tech trees, but also a lot to do with what's on the map itself, like what the map actually offers in form of gameplay. Like I guess in Warcraft 3, this is even more common, where you have like actual neutral structures that give you different bonuses, but it could be just objectives in an RTS sense. Like I think you talked in the Magic Trick podcast about a set of production structures that were like a bonus objective that you could reactivate for an AI ally, or they would just get taken over by an AI enemy. And so you have ways for both the AI and the player to engage with those in order to satisfy
That's
that.
actually a terrain spot. It's a very, very large stretch of open terrain.
Oh, okay.
So it's a very literal sense. There's a lot of space. You can take it over. Your ally will go there and build there. You can also build there too, or the enemy will make use of it. So it's like what you're saying, except it's even more like integrated into the sense that like this is a relatively closed off and volatile map, but this is an open spot in it. So that makes sense to the player from the gameplay sense of, hey, this is a good build spot. So that's how it ends up getting used by the AI as well, as opposed to just like the AI having, units and stuff here. They will build stuff there, and that gets the AI will have a switch that says if they own this and you ignored it, their production conditions will change where they'll be much more aggressive after a certain period. But if you destroy that and your AI ally takes over, then your enemies who no longer own that will adapt accordingly. So it's not that you're commanding buildings, it's that you're commanding territory. And commanding territory is something I want to be a lot like those neutral structures, where territory has a value in terms of what it offers you in terms of space and positioning.
Right. In this case, it's more like the fact that the territory is so open means that if you can secure that and hold on to it, you'll have access to an insane amount of real estate for structures like the mass fabricators and the various production and tech stuff that you were talking about. The not the fabricators, the servers and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's that's definitely a more organic way to do it, especially if you're starving the player of real estate elsewhere. You're saying, hey, like it's sort of encouraging you to try and secure that, or find a way to know that since your AI enemies are going to try to secure that too, since it's a valuable target for everybody involved, you can maybe leverage the fact that they're going to go there to maybe do something different while they're distracted trying to secure that area. You can go and claim some victories elsewhere. So there's like different ways to engage with it. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like that.
It's all about the positions as well, because like you can access this area easily, but doesn't mean you can take it easily. So if you let them take it, then you can move around it, or you can use it as an attack vector. I try to add different, like I try not to make one base only accessible through one way. I try to add different choices to how you can approach a map through the turn. So that's why we end up with an orthodox expansion placement, because I can say, hey, you can take your standard expansions, which are relatively small and save, or you can be really greedy and take these bigger expansions that are way more exposed and are really weirdly laid out and positioned in sort of threatening ways. Or you can, if you're playing really well map and dominantly, you can take everything. You just hold everything. Or you just leave them and play defensively and the AI will take them. So I just trying to think of it as like a really oddball melee map that I've played with for years and years and years and looked at from Broodwar's perspective, and I'm trying to replicate that in StarCraft 2. And it will be difficult because the AI is intrinsically different. I don't have as much control over how they attack you and what they attack you with, but or how they build, like how reliably they build. Like expansions are just an eternal hell. They were an eternal hell in StarCraft 1. They're an eternal hell in StarCraft 2. Getting them to build secondary structures at their expansions is really difficult. So that's something I undoubtedly am going to struggle with as well. But we'll just have to cross that bridge when we get there. I don't really have any guarantees for the project reaching that sweet state of completion. But I think if I can make something just enjoyable to play, then I'll have accomplished something that pretty much no one else I know in StarCraft 2 has.
Making RTS content at all is a pretty big accomplishment, especially in StarCraft 2. So I'd say you got your work cut out for you.
Well, it's definitely going to be a long time coming, especially with all the other labor I've got ahead of me. And speaking of which, I've got to get going because I've got coffee to drink, I've got to head to sleep, and I have a fuck ton of work to do tomorrow for D&D. So,
well, enjoy your game and enjoy your sleep. Thanks very much for joining me.
I'll just say one thing before we head off is I will be posting videos for development of this project. If this project is something you're interested in, I will be posting production videos in that channel at some point. So there will eventually be, like, assuming I get somewhere reasonable with it, then I'll make rundown videos of the individual maps that are like summaries of them. But I will be making like effectively video developer logs about making the models and sounds and maps and fucking whatever. So if that's something you're interested in, then keep an eye out for that.
Cool. Well, thanks again for your time. And make sure that you don't get laid off, I guess. That's all I can say.
Make sure you don't open a loot box and get that one slip with that one fucking cheeky piece of shit smiling at
It's You're the Pig themed. Oh, so inclusive.
We're including all Americans into our group.
Destroyed.
Giddy up, cowboy! Yeehaw!